Chapter 2673 The glory of one shot. Most warriors in the universe were like candles, but to be silkworms of the very high were like blazing bonfires. Han Sen had planned to spend more time observing Gru's sword skills, but now he had to fight. Han Sen's fingers twitched, and Spell's twin pistols roared madly, rapidly spitting out bullets. The steel greatsword in Gru's hands flashed like the wind, cutting each bullet in half. Not a single bullet could escape the wondrous sword lights. A heavy steel greatsword spun around Gru like a bolt of pure lightning. Those are some good sword skills, Han Sen complimented his opponent. Gru's skills were inferior to Lone Bamboo's talents, but Han Sen appreciated the fact that these techniques were incredibly stable. Every movement was rigorously practiced and could be used with a solid stance. The man was unleashing the max potential of his skills. This was the way one should always practice their sword skills. It was a way to beat someone stronger when you were weaker, or take on an opponent who had the high ground. These were the strategies that weaker people should always employ, being solid and using real strength to crush enemies, disabling opponents to deny them the chance to fight back. That was the real way to use a sword. These aren't good sword skills, Gru said. I began practicing with a blade when I was 5 years old. When I reached 30, my sword skills still weren't very good. People always thought I was dumb and unsuitable for swordcraft. But I have a sword king body. It would be wasted if I didn't practice with a sword. And so I kept on training. It has now been 46 years, and my sword skills still aren't good. All I know is that I am better than my ancestors. But still, that doesn't make me good. If you are using what you have learned, believe me when I tell you that you are already quite good. Not many people can perform this well. Han Sen knew that using a sword skill to its max potential was a harder feat than making a brand new sword skill. New sword skills could sometimes be created in moments of inspiration, but making perfect use of an existing sword skill, regardless of the environment, would take countless hours of practice and training. It required a lot of effort. As the two of them spoke, their hands never stopped moving. Swords flashes and gunfire rang out. They kept collided against each other time after time, with Han Sen's bullets falling and Gru's sword lights unable to touch his opponent. I cannot believe this Gru is so good. His sword skills are excellent. Even amongst the very high, these sword skills have to be amongst the best. Li Shuiqing chuckled. Gru is a late bloomer, Li Yuzhen said, nodding. Even though he doesn't have the speed of Pegasus, he is so stable that it's like he has weathered all the dangers of the world. If his opponent isn't considerably stronger than him, there is no way to break his sword. If the Extreme King used him as a guard, their bases would be as strong as stone. It's lucky for us that Han Sen ran into Gru first. With Gru's stability, he should be able to squeeze Han Sen out of every ounce of his power. Even if Gru loses, other silkworms will know what to expect from Han Senator. They'll know his powers, and he'll be worn out. Li Shuiqing felt at ease now. Some distance away stood a man with the head of a lion and the body of a human. He was staring at Han Sen and Gru as they conducted their battle. It looks like Han Sen isn't as talented as the legends proclaim. Without treasure, that guy is pretty much worthless. A fox woman laughed as she walked up next to Shale. Shale looked serious as he said, Gru's sword skill is King Path Sword, yet Han Sen is fighting him without exposing his moves. That alone proves how strong he is. Even my 9th-tier king body might expose my movements to the half-deified Gru. The fox woman laughed and said, You've only fallen to king class. Did your balls shrink as well? Where did the fearless Shale go, Have you seen him? Even Han Sen, who is just a 9th-tier king, can make you react this seriously? I embody the destiny of the Lionheart. I do everything I can with the utmost precision and care. I might lose, but I will not fail due to my own negligence, Shale said in a hard voice. The fox woman rolled her eyes. She looked at Shale and said, Anyway, what do you make of Han Sen's power? Can he defeat Gru? Gru is strong, but Han Sen can beat him, Shale answered. If Gru is strong, why would Han Sen win? Fox woman asked, looking interested. He might win or he might lose. Shale spoke those 6 words and stopped talking. What about you? Which of you is stronger? You or Han Sen? The fox woman looked at Shale, trying to see through his thoughts. Shale didn't move. We have never fought before. So who can tell what will happen? On the battlefield, Han Sun and Gru had performed 1,000 moves against each other. But still, Han Sun had yet to find a way to beat Gru. Han Sun had to admit that Gru was too stable for him. Han Sun started to think that if he kept fighting like this, he would die of old age before he found the man's flaws. It seemed impossible to beat Gru through skill. If agility doesn't seem to work against him, then it looks like I'll have to approach this more directly. Han Sun teleported away, establishing some distance between him and Gru. Gru, I really admire your sword skills. But we have to determine a winner between us. Therefore I am sorry. Han Sun lifted Spell's guns and took aim at Gru. Use all the moves you are able to. Gru gripped his steel greatsword tightly. His face looked placid. It was as if even the sky breaking or the earth shattering would not move him. Han Sun and the Extreme King were enemies, but Han Sun still admired his foe. Gru was a strong character, and if he became a leader among the Extreme King, their race would gain a great deal. What a shame. The Extreme King are controlled by King Bai. Gru will have no chance, Han Sun thought to himself. He aimed spell at Gru and pulled the trigger. Pang! A bullet tore out of the gun with a shriek that sounded like space itself beginning to tear. The bullet was headed straight for Gru, and Gru was frozen. He had held the sword with one hand previously, but now he carefully gripped it with two. He shouted and brought the steel greatsword above his head to swing it down on the bullet. A sword light glared with blinding intensity as it hit the bullet. The sword strike found its target, but the bullet didn't split in half. Instead it exploded. Boom! It was like a hydrogen bomb detonating. Looking at it was like staring straight into the sun. It covered Gru and most of the land. When the explosion finally faded, a huge hole had been torn into the mountain. Gru was lying in the crater, soaked in blood. His limbs were all gone, and wounds covered every inch of his body that remained. What frightening power! The audience was shocked. A 9th-tier king had used his pure power to defeat the half-deified Gru. That was astonishing. Chapter 2674 One Fighting for the Fox Woman's Side. You were right. Gru is very stable, but he lacks the sheer power needed to beat stronger enemies. He couldn't topple an opponent who had the high ground. He can't be beaten by anyone weaker than him. But when he meets an opponent who is stronger than he lacks the ingenuity to find a way to take them down. It looks like Han Sun is stronger than I thought. Even if I was half-deified, I don't think I would be able to suppress him with my current power, Shale said thoughtfully. Han Sun looked down on the bloody but not yet dead Gru. He was going to finish him with a final shot. He wasn't on good terms with the Extreme King, and someone like Gru would definitely be used against him. It would only lead to trouble further down the line. He knew he would need to finish the man off then and there. But before Han Sun could do anything, a shadow appeared next to the heavily wounded Gru. The man looked at Han Sun, grabbed Gru, and disappeared, teleporting away from the battlefield. Han Sun didn't need to guess. He knew that the very high who had taken Gru away was the same man who had signed a contract with him. What a shame, Han Sun thought to himself. Han Sun really is a legendary dude. The power of one bullet was enough to harm Gru like so. To be honest, it should make us feel embarrassed, said an approaching figure. When Han Sun turned around though, he saw more than one person. There were 3 people following the speaker. What do you guys want? Han Sun asked, looking at the 4 people. He had seen them in the information booklet he had been given. The leader of the crew was from the Extreme King. Of the remaining 3, one was Extreme King, and the other 2 belonged to other races. If they had been taken on as silkworms though, then it was obvious they weren't foes that Han Sun could take lightly. You are strong, but we want to get a good ranking. So, we will have to ask you to leave the valley, the leading Extreme King man said. After that, the 4 silkworms surrounded Han Senator, although the very high never suggested that silkworms should team up. Cooperative fights weren't forbidden, and there were no rules stating that silkworms should fight one-on-one. If things had to be one-on-one at all times, there would have been no reason to stick all 12 silkworms in a single valley. The very high didn't only want to learn from the fighting experience of their silkworms. They wanted to learn what would happen to the mind during heated exchanges, so they could determine which effects were useful and which were not. It would help the very high determine how to conduct themselves in the future. Are you going to leave with your head held high? Or are we going to have to send you home in a body bag? A mantis man asked Han Sen snidely. Han Sen laughed and said, You think you can bully me because you outnumber me? Han Sen, are you naive enough to believe we will fight you one-on-one? The mantis man said with a disdainful look on his face. He and Han Sen were both from small races. Despite that commonality, Han Sen was a famous fellow all across the universe. Even amongst the very high, he was considered a figure of much prestige. The mantis man's background was similar to Han Sen's, but he had never spent time in the limelight. That lack of fame led to him hating Han Sen quite a lot. It isn't like that. I'm just giving you a little advice. If you want to bully me, 4 of you won't be enough. You should go and enlist a few others before you push your luck, Han Sen said quietly. What idiocy. Come on then. Show us. Show us how good you believe you are. The mantis man grunted coldly, as a purple and red mantis arm suddenly broke through the fabric of space. It slashed forward, hurtling down on Han Senator. The mantis man had space power. Wherever the mantis man's arm went, a long mark was left in its wake. Han Sen fell back, but he felt as if the space his body occupied had become distorted. Although he had moved nearly 1,000 meters, the mantis man was no farther away from him. Han Sen frowned. He looked to the side, and he saw an extreme king person unleashing a weird area power. He thought it must have been the area power that was distorting the dimensions around him. As the mantis arm came down, Han Sen used spell's 2 pistols to take aim at the mantis scythe. Dong! It shouldn't have been difficult to counter the mantis arm with Han Sen's power. But when they struck each other, Han Sen felt a surprising amount of power coming against him. He stumbled back a few steps and his hands ached. He almost lost the tight grip he was keeping on those 2 pistols. Han Sen's eyes flicked back to the mantis. A weird, gold light was covering the mantis arm. That gold light was shining on all 4 half-deified actually. One of the extreme king was glowing especially brightly. That was undoubtedly his area power. Before Han Sen could react, there was an arrow headed toward him. It was a half-deified from the Aichi. The Aichi were born archers, so their talents with a bow were exemplary. Han Sen was fighting 4 people alone, which put him at a considerable disadvantage. The 4 half-deified fighters were all using their special powers in conjunction. The mantis man had a rare space power that could break space with a scythe that was practically indestructible. One of the extreme king fighters could manipulate space, whereas the other could buff the bodies of his companions. They restricted Han Sen's movements, while also making their bodies stronger. The Aichi archer was the icing on the cake. He had a scary proficiency with the bow. He kept harassing Han Sen from afar, and his area could buff the speed of the other 3. Because space was sometimes shortened or lengthened, the distance Han Sen kept between himself and his enemies was no longer reliable. The attacks that he could evade were now no longer avoidable. The distances at which he could attack the enemy were made longer, keeping him from touching them. Although Han Sen is strong, the other silkworms are very strong too. He is fighting 4 people all alone. Even I, a very high, cannot do that. He is just one Han Sen, Li Yuzhen coldly said. Li Qier and Exquisite weren't too worried, because they could sense Han Sen's heart. Although it seemed that Han Sen was being oppressed and restrained at every turn, they could feel that Han Sen's heart was like a quiet well. There was a lot of confidence inside him. Although they hadn't yet figured out where Han Sen's coincidence came from, they knew Han Sen's situation wasn't as dire as it seemed. An arrow was flying right toward Han Sen's face, and a sword light was coming at Han Sen's waist. The mantis arm and spell's pistol collided, sending Han Sen back a few hundred meters. Every second of the engagement put Han Sen in a new life-and-death situation. It seemed that if the mantis man and the others worked just a little harder, they could defeat Han Senator. The battle raged furiously. Han Sen was attacked by many areas, knife lights and sword shadows, and despite it all, he kept blocking everything that was thrown at him. He was countering the attacks of 4 people. In the beginning, those Han Sen's 4 attackers had the advantage, but as time passed, they realized with shock that their restraints on Han Sen were becoming weaker and weaker. They could no longer keep him contained within their areas. In the end, Han Sun was easily engaging all four of them at the same time. He was able to attack and defend as he pleased. This guy's battle talents are too scary, the fox woman said. She was watching Han Sun fight stunned. Each of the four silkworms was just as strong as she was. But Han Sun could fight all four of them with stability. And he was only a 9th tier king. 2675 Fighting the mantis across the mountains. I have only heard that the crystallizers were smart. I would never have believed that their bodies have grown this strong, the fox woman said with shock. That isn't the entirety of his power. His physical strength is just one aspect of his abilities. He isn't some brainless creature that is tossing his entire strength into this fight, Shale said. Do you think you will still be able to defeat him? The fox woman looked at Shale with interest. I won't lose. Shale looked the same as he always did when saying this. The four half-deifieds had no idea what to do. They were all fighting Han Sun, but they couldn't beat him. And on top of that, he was gaining the upper hand. They were the best of the half-deifieds. And they all possessed remarkable power. Normally, they could go toe-to-toe with any half-deified in the universe. Now, however, they were losing a 4-on-1 fight. And their opponent was only a 9th tier king. To say they were shocked would be an understatement. Likir and Exquisite were in shock as well. They could feel Han Sun's strength. They could also experience what it was like to be in his shoes, fighting in the way he was. The strange thing was that Han Sun had no interest in simply fighting with his Geno arts and his body. It was more like he was playing a game of chess. Watching him play was easy, and each individual move was simple. Yet assembling all those moves together to replicate his overall strategy would be very difficult. You still had to practice it yourself. This method of fighting is quite similar to the very high sense, but Han Sun has only learned under the sky. He hasn't even read the whole of the textless book, and yet, he can do all this. His talent is scary to behold, Likir said. Exquisite nodded with glee and said, This is a good thing. This will actually help us develop our proficiency with the very high sense. This is something other silkworms can never do. Pang! A bullet struck the arm of the mantis man and exploded with the scary power of Break 6 Skies. It blew the mantis man away. Even his exoskeleton was covered in cracks, and blood started to seep out of them. These four weren't like Gru. There were flaws in how they fought. Han Sun finally found an opportunity to create a distance between him and his enemies. His spell pistols began to fire without reprieve. For most of the fight, Han Sun had been too close to them to use Break 6 Skies. He had been afraid he would blow himself up, so he used less destructive Geno arts to fuel his bullets. But now that he had some distance, he no longer had to worry about injuring himself. The bullet was fired. A scary power exploded close to the four half-deifieds. They threw their arms over their heads and ran away like rats. They no longer dared to get close to Han. Senator. A bullet, infused with the power of Break 6 Skies, wasn't something they would risk trying to withstand. They didn't dare to continue the fight now. They ran as fast as they could, trying to leave the radius from which Han Sun could attack them. Han Sun didn't pursue them though. He waited until they were far enough away, then put his hands together. He combined the two spell pistols and transformed them into a sniper rifle. Han Sun raised the gun and took aim at the mantis man. He pulled the trigger. Pang! A bullet flew through the air, and the mantis man felt the power coming toward him. He knew he couldn't use his arms to block it. He had only been able to use his mantis arm to repel Han Sun's power earlier, due to the boons provided by the Extreme King area. But now all of his allies had fled the scene. None of them dared to fight Han Sun without the buffs and boons of each other's areas. Wings suddenly spread from the mantis man's back, taking him a kilometer away in an instant. He thought he had successfully dodged the bullet, but the bullet turned in the air and followed him. It even seemed to be accelerating. The mantis man's face paled. He began to loop and twist through the air. No matter what he did, though, Han Sun's attack followed him like a heat-seeking bullet. Its speed increased steadily as it pursued him. It was going to catch up and hit the mantis man at any second. The mantis man gritted his teeth and took refuge behind a mountain. He turned to stare at the mountain behind him. Pang! The bullet punched straight through the mountain without exploding. In an instant, it was in front of the mantis man. The mantis man had braced himself for the bullet to blow up the mountain, but the bullet had gone through intact. He was shocked. The mantis man crossed his arms in front of himself. He poured more power into his defenses than he ever had before, then unleashed a scary power to counter the incoming bullet. Pang! The bullet pierced through the indestructible mantis arms, then carried on straight into the mantis man's head. Then his head exploded. As the mantis man fell to the ground, the other silkworms and the audience felt their stomachs churn. The mantis man was one of the most powerful half-deifieds in existence. Han Sen had shot and killed him while he was trying his hardest to escape. That bullet was so strange and so powerful that it made those who saw it feel shocked. What Geno armament does he have? Why is it so weird? How is it so strong? It went through the mountain and the mantis arms, and still killed the mantis. Li Shuiqing frowned. It does not matter how strong he is. He still isn't as strong as a deified. Liu Zhen's scowling face betrayed the desperation of his words. Open Sky Elder laughed and said, "Such power puts him close to being deified. It might not have seemed possible for him to beat Shale before, but Shale has been reduced to king class. With Han Sen exhibiting a power like this, there is a good chance he can win." Everyone was shocked by Han Sen's frightening bullet. The other three half-deifieds ran faster than ever. They were afraid of Han Sen shooting them too. What they didn't know was that Han Sen lacked the power to fire a second attack like that. He only wanted to try out the power of heart connection. Han Sen had exhausted all his strength in doing so though. He lacked what was needed to repeat that performance. Mutant Xenogenic King hunted. Break Space Mantis. Mutant Xenogenic gene found. Obtain Mutant Break Space Mantis Beast Soul. I'm just a beginner with the skill, but heart connection is that powerful already? It is a shame that this Geno art costs too much power. I will need to rest for a while after using it. It will be some time before I can use it again. Although Han Sen heard the Beast Soul announcement, he didn't dare to pay it much heed. He knew he was being watched by Exquisite and Likier. Break Space Mantis' body was taken away by a very high woman, so Han Sen had no chance to collect the Xenogenic gene from him. Considering the power I've just demonstrated with that bullet, there should be no other silkworms coming to bother me for a while, Han Sen thought to himself. Then all of a sudden someone else appeared. Shale. Likier and Exquisite, upon seeing that body, jolted in their seats. They knew Han Sen was exhausted. He needed time to recover. He couldn't continue fighting, but Shale was right there in front of him. Upon seeing Shale, Han Sen laughed and said, "Are you that desperate to fight me? How long must you rest to get your power back?" Shale asked Han Sr. 10 hours, Han Sen answered. Good. I will let you rest safely for the next 10 hours. If anyone else draws near, I will get rid of them. Shale sat down nearby. He had blonde hair and a square face. It looked so strong and heroic. Chapter 2676 Shale. What a strong and proud man. Han Sen thought in admiration. Han Sen wasn't suspicious of the man, so he moved to sit down himself. He cast the story of genes to recover the power he had lost. Heart connection was a skill that concentrated all of the power inside one's body into a single precise point. That power would all be spent in a single use, and it would take a long time to recover. Han Sen had used heart connection because he had a way to recover in a short period of time, if necessary. He wouldn't have to wait too long before he could fight again. However, if Shale was willing to wait for him, then Han Sen wouldn't have to use his method of accelerated recovery. Up until that moment, the three half-deifieds who escaped hadn't realized that Han Sen's power had been exhausted. They regretted how quickly they had been to flee. They should have immediately attacked Han Sen again. The very high masters of the three half-deified silkworms shook their heads in dismay. The very high selected a silkworm based on three things: talent, power, and personality. Their personality was difficult to fully judge, however. The truth of a person's character was only revealed during real life and death moments. If the silkworm's personality was shown to be poor or weak during the silkworm bouts, there was every chance that their very high master might cast them away. That was the purpose of this battle royale. Although Gru had lost, the very high who had signed a contract with him was happy with his personality. Gru wasn't going to be cast out. But the Mantis Man, and the other 3 were probably going to be discarded. Of course, that was just how things looked at the moment. If the silkworms worked hard and showed that they really were resilient and determined people, there was a slim chance of them earning their master's love back. Only the dead mantis man had no chance of that. With Shale sitting nearby, no other silkworm would get close to Han Senator. He continued casting the story of genes to recover his power. He didn't do anything else. The fox woman approached Shale and glanced at Han Sun, who was focusing on his geno arts. Shale, why aren't you doing anything? I came to outer sky to practice, not to kill, Shale said expressionlessly. Have you forgotten that you're no longer deified? With the power he just demonstrated, if you allow him to recover, you might not win. Are you really willing to risk giving up the Apollo set? The woman said with a blink. Shale didn't respond, which prompted the woman to continue. If you don't want to do it, then I will. After that, the woman walked up to Han Senator. A strange light began to glow around her fingers. I told him I would protect him for 10 hours. If you get any closer, I will consider you an enemy, Shale said. You will regret this. This universe only progresses by the strong feeding on the weak. It is survival of the fittest. If you continue to act like this, you won't be strong enough to lift the rest of your race, the woman said. Maybe. Shale didn't bother arguing. Seeing that Shale had no intention of arguing with her further, the woman rolled her eyes and laughed. Shale, 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 you ate the demon fruit and fell from your deified rank. You might not beat Han Sun, but you still sound so proud. I'm afraid that in this universe, not many people can be as proud as you. Her words could have been either insult or praise, but one thing was clear. She had pitched her voice loud enough for those watching the contest to hear. Many of the very high hadn't known that Shale had eaten a demon fruit. They were shocked to hear this. Shale ate demon fruit? Liu Zhen and Li Shuiqing looked ill. The deified Shale was previously considered the strongest fighter taking part in the silkworm bouts. But if he had eaten a demon fruit, and his rank had fallen, there was the very real chance of him not winning. No wonder Open Sky Elder was willing to wager his Open Sky jewelry. He must have known that Shale ate the demon fruit and received a downgrade. Li Shuiqing gnashed his teeth. He pointed at Shale and screamed, "You idiot! You dropped down to half deified, and yet you are still behaving this proudly? Kill him while he is weak." Right now, Li Shuiqing wanted to grab Shale's hand and use it to strike Han Sun down. Liu Zhen's face turned green, but then it turned white. Clearly, there were a lot of sour emotions running through his heart at that moment. They almost coughed up blood because of how Shale was behaving. Exquisite and Li Kier, on the other hand, were delighted. Shale wasn't deified anymore, and that increased Han Sun's chances of winning. Therefore, things suddenly didn't seem as hopeless anymore. The audience might have been surprised by the news of Shale's fallen rank, but for the silkworms in the valley, the revelation breathed new life into this contest. In the foothills of the valley, a very high man squinted. Shale ate a demon fruit and became half deified? I thought there was no hope of reaching first place. I guess now there is. In a heartbeat, the very high man had teleported away and appeared on the other side of the valley. He popped into existence next to the 3 half-deified silkworms that had just been fighting Han Sun earlier. Mo Fong. When the 3 of them saw the very high man, they were given a shock. Alarmed, they gathered up all their power. Out of the 12 silkworms, aside from Shale and Han Sun, Mo Fong could be regarded as the most famous. In fact, some silkworms were more afraid of Mo Fong than they were of Han Sun and Shale. Although Mo Fong was only half deified, he was one of the very high. That fact alone made him unlike any other silkworm. Don't worry, guys. I am here to cooperate with you 3. I intend to bring you no harm, Mo Fong said with a smile. Cooperate? You mean against Shale? One of the Extreme King asked Mo Fong. Mo Fong hadn't joined them until after the woman mentioned that Shale's rank had fallen. They could easily guess what he was going to do. Not bad. If Shale was still deified, I would have stood no chance. But now that he is just half deified, why don't we cooperate and kick him out of the match? Then we can finish off the weakened Han Sun, Mo Fong said. Fighting Shale won't allow us to reach first place in the fight though. You will be the one reaping the benefits. Where does that leave us? Why would we risk our necks for you? The Aichi archer asked skeptically. Forgive me for speaking so bluntly, but with the power you guys have, you will likely be the weakest of everyone in this valley. Aside from the one who quit the match, you three will be fighting for last place. If you guys are willing to help me, once we are done, we can continue cooperating. We can knock the other silkworms out of the valley, so I can become first and you three can occupy the second, third, and fourth places, Mo Fong said. Are you serious? Pleased grins spread across the faces of the three half-deifieds. They had been cooperating from the beginning, because they already knew their powers were weak. Since when would one of the very high not live up to their word? Mo Fong said proudly. Two of the extreme king half-deifieds looked at each other. Then one of them turned back to Mo Fong. Okay, we're in. If another silkworm had come there asking that they work together, they would have hesitated. However, Mo Fong was well known. Although he was a silkworm, he was one of the very high. And being on very high land, cooperating with him would be the safest thing to do. Chapter 2677 8-Hole Emperor Han Sun had only been recovering for half an hour when Mo Fong came over to fight, the three others following behind him like ducklings. Shale glanced toward Mo Fong, and Mo Fong lifted his lips while looking back at Shale. Neither said a word, but they each knew what the other was thinking. Butterfly, are you with us, or are you with Shale? Mo Fong asked, looking at the fox woman. I'm just a weak woman. I can't help anyone, Butterfly said while falling back. She didn't want to help either side. Mo Fong knew the woman was more than she seemed. She had deliberately leaked the news that Shale was no longer deified. She obviously wanted to sit back and receive whatever benefits stumbled into her lap. But Mo Fong didn't mind. No matter how tricky she might have been, she simply wasn't strong enough to affect his chances of securing first place, he believed. For right now, only Shale was standing in his way. Shale, are you really going to protect Han Sun? Shale nodded at the others who had come with him. The three of them spread out surrounding Shale. Whether I agreed to protect him or not, I would have been forced to face you eventually, Shale said while standing up. His body was 3 meters tall. He radiated power, and he was intimidating even when he wasn't trying to be. He looked like a golden-maned lion. Mo Fong smiled and said, If you quit now, we don't have to waste time fighting. Just fight. Shale looked so calm. He had all the peaceful solidity of a mountain. Then you will have to be careful, Mo Fong said. He pointed a finger, and the evil breaker powers of the dragon spread over his fist. The dragon were widely considered the bravest race, and evil breaker powers were powers that could concentrate might. They could make the smallest attacks into the strongest attacks. It was similar to Han Sen's heart connection, but heart connection released all of someone's power at once. Evil breaker powers only concentrated the power you wanted to use at the moment. Han Sun once spent time investigating the evil breaker powers of the dragon, and he came to the conclusion that it was a very scary Geno art. Right now, Mo Fong was using the ability to summon strength. The power he gathered was stronger than that of a dragon deified. It was like his finger could form a black hole in space. Shale didn't dodge or run. His giant body stepped forward as he swung his fist. He moved so quickly that his blonde hair waved in the wind, his body surging forward like that of an enraged lion. Boom! The finger and the fist collided with each other, and the ensuing explosion tore apart the nearby terrain. Shale didn't move at all, whereas Mo Fong fell back 10 meters. Mo Fong smiled. Then he laughed and said, You truly are a born deified. Even if you are weaker now, your fitness is still incredibly rare. That was just physical power. It was nothing compared to the secret Geno arts of the very high, Shale said humbly. In regards to personal power, I'm not your equal. But I want to reach first place. Therefore I must apologize, Mo Fong said. The Extreme King fighters and the Aichi then made their move. Now, Shale was in the same type of trouble that Han Sun had previously been in. But Shale's situation was even direr. The primary difference was the swapping of Mo Fong for the Mantis Man. There was a big difference between the capabilities of those two. Mo Fong's strength was far greater than the Mantis Man's had been. It might have been an illusion, but with Mo Fong's participation, the cooperation of the others, seemed to be far better than it had been the last time. It appeared unbreakable. Mo Fong is skilled with heart techniques. With his ability to command, he can control the other silkworms, as if he was twiddling his fingers. He can allow 4 people to conduct group combat at their max potential. Shale doesn't have the power to suppress them, so it is clear that he is in danger, Exquisite said, while looking at Shale down on the battlefield. While Exquisite spoke, Shale endured a few hits. Shale was born to a small race that didn't have any good geno arts. Aside from his talent and level, his heritage was worse than Han Sen's. The few good geno arts he had were the ones he had learned during his stay in Outer Sky. It was impossible for Shale to defeat the 4 people surrounding him with his skill set. Shale might not have been less skilled than Han Sen, but he lacked Han Sen's range and diversity. He had been trapped by the areas unleashed by the Aichi warrior and the 2 extreme king fighters, and his power couldn't reach Mo Fong. He was like a beast trapped inside a cage. No matter how much he struggled, he couldn't get out of the cage, and the people outside the cage were hurting him. Mo Fong moved his fingers, as if they were 10 separate blades. Scary god lights were shining everywhere, and countless marks were being drawn across Shale's body. Mo Fong had a title. He was known as the 8-Hole Emperor. Someone who was known to be particularly empathic or sensitive was often called an 8-Face Exquisite, or a 7-Hole Exquisite Heart. Mo Fong's title was created as a combination of those 2 terms, because he could use his empathy to affect others. He became known as the 8-Hole Emperor. He could do far more than just control 3 half-deifieds. He could easily exert influence over armies comprised of tens of thousands of troops. Such a feat would be easy for Mo Fong. What a powerful body. You seem stronger than the average very high. 10 armor talents are very rare. No wonder you are so famous. Mo Fong had used his initial attack against Shale several times, but he could only shred the man's skin to leave behind minor wounds. He felt compelled to compliment his foe. Liu Zhen and Li Shuicheng's hearts almost hopped out of their chests. Right now, they weren't even worried about Han Sen beating Shale. It looked like Shale might not even last long enough to fight him. Damn it! Li Shuicheng's face darkened in rage. He thought about what might happen if Shale lost the silkworm bout. He felt dizzy, and his body kept shivering. The very high that were banking on Han Sen winning were very happy by comparison. That kid Mo Fong isn't bad. Although his power is weak, I can't think of a single very high of the young generation that is a better commander. Good job. Get rid of Shale quickly. Haha. Mo Fong will kill him. And then, he will kill Han Senator. I like this story. Shale was incurring more and more wounds. If a half-deified was any weaker than Shale, they would have already lost this fight. But looking into his eyes, it was obvious that Shale wasn't scared. He wasn't going to retreat. His eyes looked like the eyes of a lion. He was excited as a bloodthirsty beast. It was like some sort of stimulant was pumping through his veins instead of blood. Mo Fong frowned. He realized how difficult it was to harm Shale. He could use an attack against Shale once, and after that, the same attack would no longer damage him. Mo Fong had to keep changing his fighting stance, as he used one technique after another. To an outsider, it might look like Shale was being suppressed. Someone would have needed to look very close to realize how much Mo Fong was struggling. Even though the very high had thousands of geno arts, with most coming from other races, Mo Fong hadn't practiced them all. If this continued for too long, he would have to start repeating his skills. Is that it? Disappointment welled up within Shale's eyes. Chapter 2678 Scary Battle Talon. The audience soon noticed that Shale was taking fewer and fewer injuries as time went on. In addition, his wounds were recovering at an abnormally fast rate. After a short while, almost all of his injuries had vanished. He has such frightening strength. How many races with hidden power are there, scattered across the universe? Li Kier murmured in surprise. Han Sun Dollar, and now Shale, all of them were fierce. And yet they weren't members of high races. In fact, their ancestry was barely even noteworthy. And yet, they all had crazy powers that even the very high had never seen before. Many of the very high were having similar thoughts as they watched the fight. The ordinary very high, The ones who hadn't practiced the very high sense were quite average. None of them were any stronger than Han Sun or Shale. The very high that practiced the very high sense certainly had incredible abilities, but it wasn't as if the mere practice of the very high sense could give them the level of power that was now being displayed. When their silkworms became deified, however, they would gain experience that would lend them a lot of strength and willpower. Such a process would dramatically boost their development. This was the case with Exquisite and Likier. Right now, they weren't as strong as Han Senator. They couldn't defeat him in battle. Exquisite had even failed to beat him when she was a level above him. But over time, they would learn everything they could as Han Sun became deified, and it would propel them forward. Although they would not yet have achieved deified status personally, their minds would be as strong as Han Sun at deified status. When Mo Fong realized that he would be unable to suppress Shale, a strange gleam passed over his eyes. He focused his full concentration on his opponent, and his third eye tore itself open. It became a Tai Chi Yin-Yang eye that shone with crystal clarity. The moment the eye opened, Mo Fong's entire presence changed. He hadn't become the lifeless, machine-like being that Exquisite turned into, but he still wielded a power that would make all who fought against him cower. The moment his third eye opened, the three half-deifieds that were following his mental commands suddenly lurched. Their eyes lost focus. They became puppets, operated entirely by Mo Fong's will. It was like they were merely extensions of Mo Fong's body, dancing to his whims. The three half-deifieds felt sick. They had been selected as silkworms, yet they had ended up in this humiliating situation. It was very likely that their masters would end up picking new silkworms. The moment Mo Fong opened his very high eye, the situation of the battle was flipped on its head. Shale had regained the upper hand, but now he seemed to lose it again. The four silkworms were no longer a group composed of Mo Fong and the three other half-deified outsiders. It was now a group of 4 Mo Fangs. The other 3 Mo Fangs used their original powers, but their bodies were entirely controlled by Mo Fong's mind. Under that giant tide of pressure, Shale's eyes looked bright again. The fight became insane. The 4 Mo Fangs had different powers, and Mo Fong used them to make countless combination attacks. And now Shale had no chance to fight back. Although Shale wasn't yet losing the fight, he couldn't find any way to mount an effective counterattack against his opponents. The fight continued, and Shale began accumulating wounds again. At this time, the fox woman quietly walked over to Han Sun, who was still in the middle of recovering. "Ah, Han Sun, you are finally in my paws." The woman lifted her hands and placed them on his back. Han Sun was still practicing, but he could still tell what was going on around him. He knew every movement of the fox woman. He was preparing to stand up and fight her when he heard a shout. That noise came from Shale's mouth, and it was like thunder rolling across the sky. Although Shale was still in combat with Mo Fong, he had been keeping an eye on Han Sun's situation. When he saw that the fox woman was making a move behind his back, his eyes flashed. He let out that lion's roar. Suddenly, Shale's body expanded to become twice as big. All of his muscles bulged, and a red ball of light manifested like a fire outside his body. The wavy blonde mane straightened in the fire. He looked like a lion-headed demon god. Shale was having a nasty fight against Mo Fong already, but now Shale's transformation forced Mo Fong to fall back. His abrupt retreat threw off his rhythm of attacks. Shale ran toward Han Sun and threw a punch at the fox woman. The fox woman was shocked. She teleported away, vanishing like a cloud and avoiding Shale's punch. "Shale, why are you going against me on behalf of our enemy?" The fox woman frowned at Shale. "I told you I would protect him for 10 hours. Anyone who touches him will become my enemy." Shale stood next to Han Sun, looking as cold as a demon god. Mo Fong stared at Shale in astonishment. Shale's power and presence were entirely different. He had already been in such a tough fight, but he clearly hadn't been using all of his power. "Mo Fong, how about you and I fight him together?" the fox suggested to Mo Fong. She knew she couldn't defeat Shale by herself. Sure. Mo Fong didn't want to lose or abandon this fight, so he had to take advantage of every opportunity that came his way. The fox woman didn't say anything more. Her body shone with a red light that solidified into a full set of red metal-plated armor. It encased her body, leaving only her tail waving gently on the outside. That tail then split into 9. 9 foxtails were swinging in the air. The pink area then spread to enshroud the space all around them. Shale's body was suddenly ensnared by a pink chain that was barely visible in the haze. It tied up his body, and it looked as if he couldn't move. Without any communication, Mo Fong immediately guided his 4 bodies to attack Shale. All of the areas landed on Shale. When the 5 half-deifieds came against him, Shale reacted in utter rage. His eyes were on fire, and his body was like a volcanic eruption. Shale roared furiously, and a scary power exploded the binding chain. His fists were like a pair of fiery warhammers. They annihilated space and struck one of the Extreme Kings. Mo Fong guided the Extreme King to raise his arms and block the incoming strike. But beneath the cruelty of that punch, his attempt was futile. The man's arbuffed arm bones were shattered by Shale's strike. The fist proceeded to land against the man's chest, and it sent him flying away like a meteor. Pang! 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 Shale was like an unstoppable demon god. Every punch sent another enemy streaking away. Mo Fong and the other 3 silkworms he commanded hurtled through the air, and none of them had even been given a chance to fight back. The punches looked very simple, but things were actually far more complicated beneath the surface. Only Mo Fong knew that Shale's seemingly simple punches somehow subverted all of his plans to counterattack. It was like each punch was designed to stop whatever ability he tried to activate. The 4 punches were a little different each time. Different powers were released against the different bodies. There was only one explanation for how Shale could do this. He must have known the powers and attack methods of each individual fighter. That was the only way this was possible. Does this mean that while we were attacking earlier, he was studying our attack patterns? To this level? Mo Fong thought as he flew back through the air. His back slammed into a nearby mountain, and the force of the impact drove the air from his lungs in a ragged cough. Blood spilled over his lips. He struggled a little, but he couldn't get up. His heart was in so much shock, he could scarcely believe it. Chapter 2679 Close Call. Everyone stared at the match in awe. No one had expected that Shale, who had fallen from his deified rank, could wield power as fierce as this. He had even managed to injure an elite like Mo Fong with a single punch. Possessing this sort of power would make him invincible once he became deified again. Haha, I knew Shale wouldn't lose. Did Mo Fong and Han Sun seriously think that they could fight Shale? Li Xueqing was so excited that he couldn't help but cackle. Relief washed over Liu Zhen. If Shale were to lose, their lives would become very difficult in the near future. Exquisite and Li Qir were worried now. Shale was very strong, and even though he wasn't deified, it would be a very tall task for Han Sun to achieve victory. Shale, you are going to regret this. The fox lady spat spitefully at Shale. She was the only person who hadn't been punched. She stared at Han Sun for another moment then left. Shale's face was impassive. He returned to sit where he had been, and then his body returned to its normal size. Seeing that everyone nearby had been chased off by Shale, Han Sun felt safe once more. He took his time recovering, but after that fight, no one dared to disturb them again. The 10 hours went by fairly quickly. Once Han Sun had returned to peak condition, he stood up and looked at Shale. The leonine man was still calmly sitting in the same position. He looked very peaceful with his eyes closed. It seemed as if he could feel Han Sun's gaze land on him, because Shale opened his eyes and asked, "Did you rest well?" "I am completely recovered," Han Sun answered. "Then let us begin." As Shale turned his full attention on Han Sun, the red ball of light appeared around his body again. His body expanded quickly under the light's influence, returning him to that shape of a lion-headed demon god. Mutant class-born deified xenogeniac? No wonder he has a 10 armor talent. Han Sun examined Shale's power, and he went on to think, even though he has dropped to half deified, he will still be difficult to deal with. His eyes had been closed, but Han Sun had still been paying close attention to Shale's fight earlier. He knew Shale's body was no weaker than his own, and the guy's combat abilities were also good. Despite the brevity of the fight, Shale had been able to analyze the movement of his opponents in detail. That kind of fighting talent would be a challenge to Han. Senator Han Sun didn't say anything though. Instead, he lifted his hands as if they were a pair of knives. He cast under the sky and teeth knife. Shale didn't fall back. He moved forward, swinging a fist in the same moment. Their fists and palms began to collide against each other in the air. The shockwaves of their strikes detonated across the valley like fireworks. The fight between the two of them seemed like it would go on endlessly. The fitness of the two fighters seemed to be on par. It was hard to determine which of the two would reign supreme. The raw physical strength of their bodies is quite scary. But I think Han Sun has a frightening edge. After all, he is just a 9th-tier king. If he became half-deified, the power of his body would far exceed Shale's. I wonder how a crystallizer was able to develop a body this sturdy. Scary, isn't it? Are the Geno arts he practiced that powerful? Open Sky Elder murmured to himself. I think so. Not even our very high bodies can satisfy the fitness requirements of his Geno art. It would undoubtedly be much harder for other creatures of the universe. Han Sen's learning of it must have been some sort of fluke. Chiyu Elder had a wry smile. All I can say is that this kid is very lucky, Open Sky Elder said with a laugh. Pang! Fists and palms collided. Giant shockwaves of turbulent power sent Shale and Han Sun tumbling away from each other. After Han Sun regained his balance, he used his hands to slash forward. Countless knife silks appeared in the air. The knife silks were so numerous that they seemed to fill the surrounding area. Han Sun slashed forward, sending the knife silks across Shale's body. Because they came from every direction, Shale didn't even stand a chance of dodging them. Shale's eyes flashed, and he suddenly punched the ground. The ground collapsed and even nearby mountains started to crumble. Rocks fountained up around Shale's fist to intercept the knife silks. Knife silks and rocks struck each other. Many layers of the knife silks destroyed themselves against the rocks, and only a few of them made it all the way to Shale. He waved his hand to break what remained. It has been so long since I met an enemy who anticipates my next move, Han Sun sighed. That's what I was going to say as well. I have to say, you really haven't disappointed me. Shale's eyes were brimming with passion. But you've disappointed me. I was thinking I could get first place easily, but it currently feels impossible. Han Sun felt a bit thirsty, and he licked his lips. That was one of his habits. When he faced things he had no confidence in dealing with, he frequently did this. Life is disappointing sometimes, Shale said, a moment before swinging his fist again. His punches were very simple. However, they didn't remind Han Sun of a complicated technique that had been developed into a simplified form. Instead, Shale used a raw basic punching skill. A skill like that could be found amongst any of the smaller races. But Shale had taken that basic punch up more than a few notches. He had practiced the skill to a level that was too much for Han Sun to deal with. Han Sun cycled between a few knife skills and punching techniques. Each of them was a top-notch Geno art. Some of them were from the rebate, whereas others came from Sky Palace. Each style he used was unique. Every time he used a new skill, Han Sun felt like he had gained the advantage. For a moment at least. Then Shale always swooped in to take that advantage away. Plus, Shale used the same punching skill the entire time. He didn't alter his own skills until he became familiar with Han Sen's Geno arts. Then, he changed his punching skill, just enough to counter each of Han Sen's techniques. Fuck this guy. He wasn't just born deified. He was born a battle master as well. He is far too sensitive to the delicacies of combat. I only have to use the same skill on him twice before he learns how to deal with it. Who is this fucking guy? Han Sun had never seen such intimidating battle talent. Shale and Lone Bamboo were different. Because Lone Bamboo had experienced far too much in his lifetime, he could adapt and control his style perfectly. He could easily learn the Geno arts of other people, and every technique he used was top class. Shale didn't bother actually learning the Geno arts of others. He simply made himself more powerful and brute-forced his way through all obstacles. It was like his one skill could break down 1,000 skills. It wasn't that the skill depended on power. Power was only one part of it. Rather, Shale could apply his skill creatively enough to counter all sorts of different attacks. Shale had a powerful mind, and that was the source of his ability to counter his opponents. He has a powerful body with incredible endurance, not to mention a problem-solving mind. This guy is giving me a headache. Han Sun experimented with many Geno arts, but he couldn't defeat Shale. But Han Sun was different from Mo Fong. When Mo Fong used the same Geno art twice, Shale could pick up on the flaws. But even when Han Sun used the same Geno art multiple times, Shale was unable to see the errors. That surprised Shale a great deal. He could see the flaws in Han Sun's execution. But when Han Sun used the same skill again, something kept Shale from exploiting those mistakes. Shale tried to target the weaknesses in Han Sun's Geno art several times, but his attempts always failed. He had never experienced a situation like this before. Chapter 2680 Leveling Up. While fighting, the two of them continued fighting, but they were unable to deal damage to each other. Han Sun kept altering his knife skills. Shale's punching skill didn't change in the face of Han Sun's rapidly mutating attacks. The two of them fought as hard and fast as they could, but neither of them could gain the upper hand. It had been a very long time since Han Sun had a fight like this. In his recent fights, he had either lost to his enemies or crushed them almost immediately. He hadn't put so much energy and effort into a fight since his contest with Lone Bamboo. A fight like this drained a lot of energy from his body. It also forced him to use his mind constantly. If he made a mistake, his enemy would take advantage of the window and beat him. He couldn't afford to make a single misstep. As the Very High watched the pair conduct their battle, conflicted looks appeared across their faces. Both of the fighters were king class, but their minds were deified. The fight was so nuanced that the onlookers didn't know what to make of it. This was no ordinary battle. This fight took effort and brainpower. Many of the attacks and counters seemed simple, until the audience took a second to consider why the two fighters had chosen those moves. Every single action in this fight was done with an ulterior motive. It looked like a simple fist and knife fight, but people would be thinking about it for a long time afterward. Li Yuzhen and Li Shuicheng's bodies were quivering. It was hard to tell who was going to win and who would lose. It looked as if winning or losing would only come from a hair-thin lead. Big brother, having Shale as your silkworm is very fortuitous for you. Bishi looked at his big brother Li Chunxiu with grand admiration. Yu Shanshin isn't bad either, Li Chunxiu said distantly. Since Shale was his silkworm, he wasn't really paying much attention to their conversation. He felt as if he was fighting Han Sun himself, right then and there. But there were many fighting minds and techniques he had to learn that he had never previously encountered. It felt so strange. Experiencing the battle from Shale's perspective was unique. He felt like he was fighting himself, but at the same time, he could step back and examine Shale's choices with a critical eye. He could tell which decisions Shale made were better than his opponent and vice versa. He only absorbed the good battle experiences, while figuring out and filing away the bad ones. Right now Shale was only half deified. In the future, Shale would travel through the deified ranks of primitive, transmutation, larva, butterfly, and maybe even true god. Li Chunxiu could slowly absorb everything that Shale experienced. At that point, Li Chunxiu would only be half deified. But he would have the experience of a true god. Li Chunxiu could slowly study everything that Shale had learned through his evolution. Although he would only be half deified himself, his mind would be on a different level. Bishi looked bitter as he said, "This Yu Shanshin hides a great deal from me. He is so strong and tough. He is a difficult nut to crack. Even now, I have yet to learn a single thing from his mind. Those silkworms might be the most challenging, but they're also the most rewarding. Conquering them will yield better results in the long run," Li Chunxiu said. "You are right, but, well, never mind. I bet Exquisite and Liqueur have the same problem," Bishi said. Exquisite and Liqueur did have trouble, but Han Sun let them in when he fought. Like Li Chunxiu, they gained a lot of battle experience from Han Senator. Each decision he made taught them a lot. But while Han Sun was a 9th-tier king, he had a scary power and a scarier mind. It made them so happy. Even if Han Sun lost this fight, just getting to experience this battle would be more than worth it to them. One thing caught them off guard though. Despite the intensity of the fight, They could sense that Han Sun was deliberately hiding the true range of his powers. Is Han Sun not using all of his strength? The possibility stunned them. He was already fighting at an unbelievable level. And yet he didn't seem to have tapped into the full potential of his power. That was a scary thought. Li Qiu had always thought Dollar was stronger than Han Sun. But she now found herself looking at the man with a complicated expression. Although he was fighting an elite like Shale, Han Sun could still hide some of his power. This was no longer just an intimidating display of ability. It was out and out frightening. Although Han Sun tried his best to close off his mind and avoid thinking about the Dongxin Sutra and his super god spirit body, Li Qiu and Exquisite were still able to pick up that he was suppressing something. They would come to know that Han Sun was hiding his true power, but that couldn't be avoided. In truth, Han Sun's ability to suppress his thoughts at all in this situation indicated that the power of his mind was terrifyingly profound. In a fight like that, most people would need to constantly think about which Geno arts and powers they were good at. This guy is too scary, Li Qiu said while she watched Han Sr. He is rather frightening, isn't he? I don't think he will ever fail to surprise us. Every time we think we have seen it all, he goes the extra mile and does more, Exquisite said with a nervous smile. When she fought Han Sun, she thought that she had forced him to cast many of his skills. But it now looked like Han Sun had only used a fraction of his talent when he was fighting her. He was now bringing out more tools, but even more were still being kept hidden. We must dig into this man and unearth all of his secrets, Li Qiu said. Her eyes were brimming with excitement. Li Qiu had better potential than Exquisite, but she didn't focus on the very high sense. Her very high forget love wasn't as developed as Exquisite's, so she was prone to becoming more emotional. Exquisite only coldly said, "There is no rush. We have 4 years. He will reveal his secrets to us in time. It doesn't matter that he has managed to hide it all for now." Open Sky Elder looked a bit gloomy, and he said, "The smallest move could determine how this plays out. Either one of them could win at this point. Han Sun is strong, but he is just a 9th-tier king. He is ranked lower than Shale. If they were in the same class, Han Sun would have a 70% chance of winning." Jiu Elder shook his head and said, "No, it doesn't work like that. Shale is half deified, but his will is deified. Han Sun is just a 9th-tier king, and yet he is holding his own against a powerful half-deified. That means his talent and potential are scarier than Shale's. Does that mean the 11 armor talent test was legit?" Open Sky Elder wondered with a frown. "It is hard to say. If he isn't doing this well because of his talent, then it is hard to imagine what Han Sun has that is letting him fight Shale." Jiu Elder looked at Han Sun, his face conflicted. A 10 armor talent is very rare. A real 11 armor talent would make a man the greatest of his generation. Do you think Han Sun is this kind of great man? Open Sky Elder asked, looking a little worried. "I'm not sure about that, but it is plain to see that his talent is stunning. Li Qiu and Exquisite got lucky when they signed a contract with him," Jiu Elder said. "What is going on? Something is wrong with Shale." Open Sky Elder wanted to say something, but he was in too much shock. Then his face went white. He looked at Shale in the video and screamed, He's going to level up." Chapter 2681. Back to Deified. Everyone could see the strange expression on Shale's face. As time passed, the red ball of light that surrounded him dimmed, then darkened. Then the dark red color began to change to solid black. It must be the demon fruit. The demon fruit is working. Is Shale going to become deified right in front of us? Li Shuiqing merrily proclaimed. Liu Zhen was thrilled as well. Now I understand. Shale knew that the silkworm fights were going to start, but he decided to eat the demon fruit anyway. He hoped to use the pressure of a challenging silkworm fight to accelerate his growth and activate the dormant demon fruit power that resided in his body. During his fight with Han Sun, the demon fruit inside him has slowly been refined. Now it must have all been absorbed. It will make him deified in the middle of this very fight. Shale is really leveling up to deified? There will be no more debating which of the two will emerge victorious now. It will be impossible for Han Sun to defeat a deified Shale. Li Shuiqing had been quivering with fear earlier. but now his quaking was due to unbridled glee. This silkworm fight had been a non-stop roller coaster of emotions for the two men. Li Xuecheng's emotions had gone up and down so much that he had thought his heart was going to leap out of his chest. The fires around Shale's body turned black. Black symbols were appearing across him, as if they were being carved into his exposed skin. A frightening presence was emanating from the symbols. Shale's power began to generate substance chains. Back to deified once more? Han Sun frowned. He wasn't blind. He could see that Shale's power was changing. Shale tipped his head back and roared to the sky, and the power of his substance chains exploded. His previously golden hair was suddenly dyed pitch black. Shale used to look like a gold lion. Now his body had shrunk, but his muscles looked more solid and powerful than ever. It was like every cell in his body had filled up with an unimaginably grand power. The new, black-haired Shale didn't look as wild. He looked mysterious and alien. The black symbols were visible all across his face, and black flames quivered across his body. He looked like some sort of demon lion from hell. He has returned to deified. Li Qir's face looked sickened. It didn't matter how talented or strong Han Sun was. He couldn't defeat a deified Shale. After all, deifieds were completely different from all other ranks beneath them. They were as different as the sky and the ground. Shale must have planned from the beginning to use this fight to become deified again. He wanted to use Han Sun as his whetstone. Exquisite said glumly, then sighed. She understood the truth behind it all now. That was excellent planning on Shale's part, Li Qir said with a grunt. He ate the demon fruit before the silkworm fight. If no one presented him with a serious challenge, he could secure first place. If he did find someone who could stand up to him, he could refine the demon fruit and return to being deified and still secure first place and all the spoils. He is a very smart man, I will confess. Exquisite shook her head. But again, it isn't that simple. A normal person would struggle to become deified again, whether or not they refined the demon fruit. Shale was able to become deified because his talent was that exceptional. This may not have been his plan at all. No matter what his reasoning was, these are the results, Li Qir said in frustration. Chiyu Elder and Open Sky Elder both looked very ill, and the very high people who had placed big bets on Han Sun looked just as bad. They thought they had seen a sound hope of victory, but it was all gone now. Since the moment Shale became deified, their hopes and dreams were squashed. Their hearts fell to the bottom of the blackest abyss, and they couldn't see the light of hope anymore. I apologize. I tried to control my power, but I was unable to suppress it. I have now returned to deified class. Shale ceased attacking. He felt guilty about what had happened. What he said made everyone watching want to cough up blood. Many creatures wanted nothing more than to become deified, and Shale had been doing his best not to. That was quite upsetting. If anyone else had said this, they might have sounded cocky. But Shale was renowned for his honesty, and he certainly wasn't putting on an act. He had genuinely tried to suppress his power, but he ended up becoming deified anyway. He had wanted to finish this fight as a half-deified, but fighting Han Sun had required too much from him. He had no choice but to use his full power to fight, and so he was unable to hold back the energy of the refined demon fruit. Once that dam of power broke loose, he had become deified. There is no need to apologize. Your level is a part of your power. Han Sun didn't think it was shameful for someone to fight against an opponent of a lower level. If someone had a higher level, they must have earned it. Today's fight won't count. I will wait until you become deified, and then we will fight again, Shale said, looking at Han Sr. This fight isn't finished yet. Han Sun responded, his face unchanged. Shale shook his head. Although I don't want to win while you are at a lower level, I still need this first place. So I'm sorry. We should abandon this battle for now. There is no need to apologize. Didn't I just say our fight hasn't ended yet? If you can win, then it was because you were better than me. But in order to decide that, we must first fight and see who the victor truly is. Han Sun gazed at Shale calmly. He didn't look very emotional. When Liu Zhen heard Han Sun say this, he coldly laughed and said, "This Han Sun really doesn't know his place. Shale has given him plenty of opportunities to bow out gracefully, and he even offered to leave this place together. That meant he would give Han Sun second place. But still the brat insists on fighting. If he gets kicked out right now, he definitely won't end up in second place either. Liqueur exquisite. And all the other very high thought Han Sen's response had been too cocky. He should have accepted second place instead of losing now. But in contrast to their own thoughts, Liqueur and Exquisite didn't detect any fear within Han's Senator. Instead, they felt an overwhelming sensation of calm and confidence in him. There was no need to be angry. There was no need to hate. There was no need to blame fate or the people around him. This powerful, placid confidence was something only superior people could possess. But now Han's son is a ridiculously dire situation. Why is he still this confident? Exquisite and Liqueur thought that Han's son had no reason to be so self-assured. But his confidence was so strong that it affected them anyway. They began to feel like they should trust in Han Sr. Come on. Keep going. I will fight you. Whether I win or lose, I will walk out of here alone, Han's son said calmly as he looked at Shale. Yes, this is how it should be. Shale's eyes flared with excitement. He looked at Han's son, as if he was looking at his favorite piece of art. Perhaps Han's son's power wasn't as strong as Shale's, but Shale wouldn't underestimate him. The substance chains around him exploded madly. He was like some leonine power of darkness that had crawled up from the depths. Because of the respect I have for you, I will fight with all my power. Shale's voice was like thunder as he swung his fist at Han Sr. Chapter 26 82 Demonic Power. The fist leapt forward, and the shadow that trailed behind it looked like a raging lion. Hansen didn't even have enough time to dodge. The scary lion shadow had already washed over him. Hansen looked stable though. Spell turned into armor to protect his body, and he used God's wonder to quickly flash away. He was attempting to evade the crazy shadow of Shale's punch. BZD. Suddenly, Hansen felt as if the physical space around had been sealed. He couldn't rip space and teleport away as he wished to. He could only see the crazy lion shadow punch coming down on him. Hansen frowned. He gathered up power in his fist to throw a punch back at the lion shadow punch. But Hansen's punch went through the lion shadow punch. It was like the lion shadow punch really was just a shadow. When the lion shadow punch actually landed on Hansen, it wasn't as hard as he expected it to be. The punch went into Hansen's body and vanished. Boom! Hansen's presence turned black, and his image warped until he started to look like Shale. His entire body was consumed by a black fire, and he looked identical to his opponent. Hansen frowned. He realized that he hadn't been hurt, and his power had become the same element as Shale's. Aside from that, there had been no negative effect. No damage had been dealt to him, either. But as the black fire finished spreading over Hansen, Shale said, "My demon lion power isn't destructive, but it will transform your body's element. I guess it is a demonic power. If you cannot hurt your opponent, then what is the point of your demonic power?" Hansen asked. Millions of different powers exist throughout creation. I cannot break down every single one, but no matter what power my opponent might have, I transform their element into my own. Since I am familiar with this sort of power, none will be able to beat me, Shale said. When Hansen considered the ramifications of that, he realized how scary Shale's power truly was. At his current rank, Hansen's power simply wasn't as great as Shale's. If Hansen was able to depend on his various elements and his special skills, he still had a chance to defeat Shale. But now that his power had been converted into an element that Shale was already extremely proficient in wielding, Hansen could no longer compete. Even if he was incredibly compatible with this new element, there was no way he would be as dexterous as Shale with its use. He wasn't going to be able to defeat Shale with the man's own power. Bring your enemy into the same harmony as your own, and then wipe your foe out with a symphony of destruction. Why does Shale's power suddenly seem to remind me of something? Hansen thought to himself. But Shale wasn't going to give Hansen much time to think things over. He swung another punch at him. With a sinking feeling, Hansen began to understand just how debilitating the conversion of his power had been. He wasn't physically damaged, and with time, he could have gained enough understanding of this new element to use it in combat. However, a high-level opponent like Shale wouldn't give him enough time to adapt. Teleport. Keep teleporting. Han Sun began to depend solely on God's wonder to keep himself out of Shale's reach. He was unable to rally his defenses and fight back. Turning the tide of this battle was going to be difficult. Han Sun wasn't familiar with his new power at all. He had no idea what the power inside him could even do. He didn't know what its features were. No matter which Geno art Han Sun tried to use, he could only cast power in Shale's strange element. Han Sun is going to lose, it seems, Li Shuiqing said. His eyebrows painted him as a very happy man. Everyone now knew that Han Sun didn't have a chance. He was beneath Shale's level, and he was both weaker and slower than Shale. Now that his power element was the same as Shale's, under such extreme circumstances, how could anyone expect Han Sun to come out of this fight victorious? This would have been true of any person of Han Sen's level who found themselves confronted by a monster like Shale. Even if another deified creature went up against Shale, they wouldn't be able to defeat him if they were forced to use his element. Shale's demonic power was quite mysterious. Copying the powers of an opponent wasn't exactly rare, but his power was able to force his opponent to copy him. It was a little unfair, truth be told. Open Sky Elder had a wry smile. Chiyu Elder shook his head. There is a reason for Shale's fame. This is why he is called the best against those of the same level. Every power has an element it is weak to. No matter how unique an elite's power is, there is always some other power that will suppress it. But Shale's demonic lion power ignores that universal truth. His ability is scarier than anyone can imagine. Han Sun focused his entire mental power on developing familiarity with the power Shale wielded. But time was too short. He could have used this new power in basic combat applications, but fighting someone like Shale was next to impossible. Pang! Han Sun was too late teleporting away this time. Shale's punch struck his arm, and spell turned into armor to protect him. But even so, Shale's strike still almost shattered the bones in his arm. Han Sun could use God's wonder, but so could Shale. And Shale was quite skilled with the technique. Han Sun kept teleporting away, but he couldn't shake the opponent on his tail. As the fight progressed, he was incurring more and more wounds. Pang! Han Sun took a punch straight to the chest. His body shot away like a cannonball and slammed into the seal. The power that bound the arena trembled for a moment. Han Sun's body hit the ground, and he couldn't help but cough up a mouthful or two of blood. His chest felt like a cinder block had fallen on it. Han Sun knew the heat was likely just the blood inside his lungs. In fact, his lungs weren't the only part of him that was suffering. Han Sun's entire body was covered in injuries. Many parts of his spell armor had been cracked. The worst place just so happened to be his chest. The right side of his chest had been dented inwards. The spell armor was practically broken, and Han Sun's body was not doing well. One of his arms was just hanging loosely beside his body. It felt as if all the bones inside him were broken. He couldn't even move. One of his legs had been shattered too. Han Sun could only kneel on the spot. Han Sun couldn't remember the last time he had been in such poor condition. Even when he was sucked dry by the shield of the Medusa's gaze, he hadn't been so grievously injured. But even so, Han Sun didn't feel like giving up. He was more excited than ever actually. That excitement came from the spell armor. Although his armor appeared to be on the verge of falling to pieces, it suddenly seemed as if it was going to break through. The story of genes was the hardest Geno art to develop. Out of all the arts he was proficient with, under Shale's powerful suppression, it seemed as if it was going to combine all 9 tiers into one. He was going to become half deified. Almost there. I only need a little bit more. Han Sun reviewed the sensations running through him in detail. He seemed to be on the cusp of breaking through, but it still felt as if he was missing something. It was like he was trying to scratch his feet through his socks, but he couldn't quite satisfy the itch. Let us end it here. Shale wasn't interested in continuing this fight any further than he had to. Even though he had admitted that Han Sun was a worthy opponent, Han Sun was just a 9th-tier king. Han Sun didn't have what it took to fight him. He was hoping for another fight when Han Sun became deified. Shale swung his fist again. The terrifying power of the blow was like a dark, roaring, demonic lion, which was headed straight for Han's senator, and Han Sun was still half kneeling on the ground. Chapter 2683 Leveling up to half-deified. Shale's punch roared down toward him. But Han Sen didn't plan on trying to evade it. He used the left hand that he could still move, summoned power into his fist, and threw a punch. Why even bother? Losing is better than dying. The fox woman sighed mournfully from the distance as she watched. The seal was right behind Han's senator. He could teleport away before the punch came down on him. And it seemed like the only viable choice to ensure his own survival. But he didn't. Instead, he carried on fighting with his now broken body. But considering how injured and outmatched he was, it seemed unlikely that any strength he mustered would be enough to withstand a punch delivered by Shale. He doesn't know his place. Kill him. Liu Zhen clenched his fists into tight, white-knuckled balls. His eyes were red as he shouted spitefully at the video feed. Li Shuicheng was the same. This fight was about to end in exactly the way he had been hoping for all along. They were going to win the bet. There was no way that Han Sen could avoid the punch that was coming down on him. And there were only two possible results of trying to block that blow. He could either die or be disabled. Whichever actually happened, Han Sen couldn't reasonably carry on fighting. No one was going to stop Shale from reaching first place in the silkworm bout. Pang! Han Sen's fist struck that scary punch. The armor that protected his fists and his arms exploded, and Han Sen's entire body flew forward. As he sailed through the air, his spell armor shattered to pieces like a broken vase. Game over. Open Sky Elder was very sad to see this. He thought he had lost his Open Sky jewelry. Exquisite and Li Kier's faces changed. Han Sen's heart never gave up hope. He kept sending them the message that he could keep on going, no matter the odds. But his self-geno armor was broken, and his body was severely injured. Hopefully he would survive, but he couldn't keep on fighting. Now they could only pray that Han Sen didn't succumb to the remaining force of the impact. Exquisite was tempted to leap onto the battlefield to save him from doom. Many of the very high people who had believed Han Sen was going to win were now all silent. Han Sen had tried his best, but there was too much of a gap between the powers of a king and a deified. Shale was too strong, and so they couldn't blame Han Sen for losing. However, their hearts bled when they thought about everything they had bet and were going to lose. Only Li Shuicheng and Liu Zhen were excited enough to start jumping around with glee. They almost hugged each other. After this fight, they'd reap a bounty of rewards. The resources they were about to receive might support them all the way up to the deified butterfly class. And on top of that, they'd also lay claim to priceless treasures of untold might. Pang! Han Sen's body slammed against the seal again. Liu Zhen and Li Shuicheng were ready to start clapping, but they suddenly froze in place. They weren't the only members of the audience who were staring in shock. Everyone was. After Han Sen's body hit the seal, he didn't fall to the ground. He just remained where he was. He was floating. That broken body of his was releasing a weird shockwave that they could barely detect. Then his form became shrouded in bright light. But when they looked closer, they could see that it wasn't a bright light. It was a cloud of white powder like dust. And the white powder was gathering around Han Sen's body. In the blink of an eye, a white set of armor had wrapped itself around Han Sen's body. The broken spell armor was back, and it looked as good as new. No. It was even more powerful than before it had been damaged. The symbol on the armor was shining brilliantly, releasing a scary presence. The holy light wrapped slowly around Han Sen's body. He was like some god spirit from a holy mountain. He is becoming half-deified. Exquisite and Li Kier were the first to react to this. They could feel that Han Sen's power was exploding in the breadth of its magnitude. In the middle of all that, he became half-deified. This guy is too much. Many of the very high, who were watching the fight, looked absolutely stunned. It was possible to level up during a fight, but leveling up required a lot of power to support. In Shale's case, he had already taken in the demon fruit, and he was supremely powerful already. So, it made a certain amount of sense that he was able to break through during a fight and become deified. But Han Sen's body was entirely broken. His self-armor had been wrecked. In that injured state of his, it should have been impossible for him to level up. But Han Sen had become half-deified in that situation. It was a difficult thing to grasp. So what if he is half-deified? Half-deifieds are just another form of king class. He can't fight Shale, Li Shuiqing snarled, gnashing his teeth. He wasn't happy to see this. He only hoped Shale still had what it took to kill his opponent quickly. But Shale merely looked at Han Senator. He didn't attack him like Li Shuiqing wanted him to. You are a perplexing man. You became half-deified, even in the middle of all this, Shale said while looking at Han Sr. It was just a stroke of good luck, Han Sun said with a smile. Shale shook his head with a grave sense of gravitas. There is no such thing as luck in this universe. Luck is a rigged lottery. Any winner might think that they are lucky, but no matter how lucky they are, they wouldn't have won if they never bought the ticket. Han Sun didn't say anything. He really hadn't been depending on luck. Just before Shale's last punch, Han Sun had finally come to understand the key that would allow the 9 tiers of the story of genes to combine into one. He realized how to become half-deified. That was why he had taken that punch. That power was enough to make his spell armor break completely, and then rebuild itself. But what a shame. If you were deified, we could really see which of us is better, Shale said with a look of regret. We can still find out, I think. Like I told you once before, our fight has not yet ended, Han Sun said expressionlessly. Shale shook his head and said nothing. He was happy to admit that Han Sun was strong, but half-deified was still king class. Han Sun wasn't as strong as him. He still didn't think Han Sun had enough power to challenge him. Brother Han, let us end this here. The Apollo set can be set aside for now. When you become deified, you can fight me for it. And if you win, you can take the Apollo set, Shale said after a brief moment of thought. A good opponent was like a fine wine. It needed time to truly reach its potential. Shale wanted Han Sun to become deified before he fought him again. But Han Sun didn't have the patience to wait that long. Seeing that Shale wasn't going to attack, Han Sun decided to stop talking. Instead, he lifted his hand like a knife, then used Fang to strike at Shale. Shale frowned. He had already decided to end the fight. He gathered up demonic powers again, and his fist became a demonic lion that went straight for Han Sen's body. Just like before, Shale's fist blurred forward, and Han Sen's power transformed into the demonic mirror of Shale's own abilities. It is the same. Does Han Sun not understand that if his power is forced to match Shale's, he can never beat him? Li Shuiqing trailed off halfway through his statement. The demonic power had definitely sunk into Han Sen's body, but the powers that Han Sun was using for his attacks were not demonic like before. The teeth knife he lashed out with was still a purple knife. It was not affected by the demonic power. Chapter 2684 I Am the Path. The power of Han Sen's spell armor had been static for a long time. Earlier in the fight, it had been unable to block Shale's demonic attacks because the man had simply used too much force for it to repel. But now, the spell's 9 tiers had been combined and condensed into one. Its power solidified, and that new density allowed the armor to ignore the difference in power between the two fighters. Its energy could no longer be converted to the demonic element. Shale was a bit shocked by this twist. He used his demonic powers a few times more, but try as he might, he was unable to change Han Sen's element. He had realized that Han Sun had discovered a way to fight back against the demonic power he wielded. Han Sun is somehow holding off the demonic power. That is a bit unexpected, Open Sky Elder said with raised eyebrows. Although the demonic powers no longer change him, he is still a half-deified going up against a deified. There is a large gulf in power. It will still be an incredibly difficult fight for Han Sun if he seeks victory, Chiyu Elder said. Even so, as small as it may be, he stands a chance. Open Sky Elder put all his hopes on Han Sen's newfound opportunity. Although Shale's demonic power had lost much of its effectiveness, Han Sun was still suppressed by his opponent's might. There was still a staggering difference in their power levels, and Han Sen's Geno arts had only been reinforced to a half-deified level. It still wasn't going to be enough for Han Sun to fight a deified elite. Under constant pressure from Shale, Han Sun had to keep changing his movements. He teleported and dodged, keeping Shale from landing a fatal blow. Han Sun still didn't have enough power to engage Shale directly. Every move Shale made carried dangerous strength, But Han Sun was managing to keep him from hitting his target. Exquisite and Li Qier could feel the calmness in Han Sen's heart. Every time they saw Han Sun on the brink of death, he would surprise them and turn out no worse for wear. They were on the edge of their seats, and the rest of the audience was even more nervous. Han Sun was walking a tightrope. If he wasn't careful, he would fall into a bottomless abyss. Although his situation looked perilous in the extreme, Han Sun was holding on. Beneath Shale's oppression, he was able to avoid further injury. The cons of Shale being from a smaller race are finally coming to the surface. Li Chunqiu sighed in his heart. Shale was very talented, and he could challenge all sorts of Geno arts and perform miracles with his ordinary punching techniques. With his demonic powers, he could go against any deified elite at the same level. But now, his demonic powers weren't working. That meant the simplicity of his punching techniques might not cut it. No matter how good a driver someone might be, that skill would still only allow them to drive a car. Even the best driver in the world wouldn't suddenly develop the ability to fly planes. Shale's punching skills were so simple. He could only use ordinary methods as he tried to win this fight. He didn't have the power to simply end the fight in a moment. He definitely had an advantage, but he had been unable to take Han Sun down. If Shale could practice in outer sky for a few more years and learn many more top-class Geno arts, with his power and talent, he could definitely defeat Han Sun. Li Chunqiu thought to himself. He went on to think, this Han Sun is strong. Any ordinary half-deified would find themselves completely outmatched by Shale. They couldn't fight him. Within a repetition or two, Shale would analyze their skills and break them. But Han Sun's skills have been repeated many times, and yet Shale still cannot break them. Li Chunqiu could sense everything that Shale was feeling. Although the fight had changed dramatically, Shale was still determined to do his best to crush Han Sr. But Li Chunqiu could see that there were many moments Shale was certain he would get Han Sun. But each time, he failed to lay a finger on his opponent. Li Chunqiu began analyzing Shale's mind. He finally discovered why Shale was unable to break Han Sun's skills. Shale needed to see a Geno art to see through his opponent's flaws. And Han Sun's use of Geno arts was not flawless. There were too many flaws to be exact. When Shale tried to make use of these flaws, he soon learned that the flaws were traps deliberately laid by Han Senator. They didn't do much harm to Han Sun's use of a skill, but they were enough to trap his enemy and provide Han Sun with some breathing room. Every technique had flaws. There was no such thing as an unbreakable Geno art. But Han Sun hid the true flaws of his skills within artificial flaws. For every real flaw, there were 9 ones to throw his enemy off course. He let Shale guess which flaw was the real one each time. But even after all this time, Shale had been unable to guess which flaw was the correct one. There are 50 paths to choose from, and there are 49 you can pick. Take away one, and it will become a fixed number and a variable. Imperfection is this world's true perfection. Han Sun has learned the meaning behind what it means to take away one. This guy is so scary. When he grows up, he might end up better than the kids of the very high. Open Sky Elder stared at the battle with wide eyes. I have heard his self-Geno arts have required a lot of resources. Even with 4 years in the very high, I don't know if he will make it to deified. Even if he does become a primitive deified, who in this universe could provide him with enough resources to keep him going beyond that? Chiyu Elder shook his head. He wasn't very hopeful of Han Sen's future. What a shame. If he was born as a very high, he might have been another Li Chunqiu. We would give him all the resources he required. He could have entered the Geno Hall for sure. Open Sky Elder said. Don't even think about it. You know Old Stubborn won't let an outsider become a true child of ours, Chiyu Elder said with a wry smile. Upon hearing that, Open Sky Elder sighed and said, sometimes, I envy Zhang Xiandao of the sky. At least he can do whatever he wants. We cannot do anything. Chiyu Elder's face changed. You can only say that here. Don't let Old Stubborn hear you say something like that. You know there are harsh feelings still lingering about the sky betraying our people. Open Sky Elder shook his head and said nothing. He continued to watch the fight between Han Sun and Shale unfold. Shale's punches were like demonic lions. Every punch looked as if it could swallow the sky and eat the sun. Han's Sun was like a small boat surfing the crazy waves of the sky and the ground. But no matter how scary Shale's fists were, he was still unable to defeat Han's Senator, a single kernel of corn on a big sea. Han's Sun was that kernel, but he could float. It didn't matter how much the sky and earth raged. They couldn't take him down into the abyss. Now Han's Sun's mind was very clear. He used Under the Sky and God's Wander. He kept casting from his hands one after the other. Every knife seemed as if it flipped the sky and the earth. He had practiced knives for so long. He had learned from the minds of many others. But now, it was Han Sen's own will and mind that Shale was putting under pressure. The sky and the ground are the chessboard. I am one of the chess pieces. But as they move across the sky and the earth, the meaning of the chess pieces is increased. There are 1,000 ways for them to be used, and you need a chess piece to follow a path. Without a chess piece, there is no path. Han Sen's heart suddenly opened up within him, and he spoke as if he was in a trance. Under the sky, I am the path. If I live, the path lives. If I die, then the path dies. Chapter 2685 Learning Knife. Han Sen's voice wasn't very loud, but the very high and a few of the silkworms were focusing very carefully on this fight. They heard everything Han Sen said. You are crazy. That word suits you very well. Liu Yuzhen coldly grunted. He had to be insane. And Liu Yuzhen wasn't the only person thinking that. Even Open Sky Elder and the people who wanted Han Sen to win believed everything he had said was way too crazy. The path was the universe. The universe was the path. When they considered Han Sen's words, he seemed to be saying that his life was the sole reason for the universe to exist. If Han Sen died, the universe would die along with him. Across history, even the true God elites wouldn't have dared to say something like that. There were not many true God elites, but there were a few in every era. How many were currently alive was unknown though. And even when they died, the universe never died along with them. And right now, Han Sen was someone who had just become half deified. In truth, his words didn't even qualify as crazy. They were simply ignorant. But people misunderstood what Han Sen meant. The I he was referring to did not mean himself. He was referring to everything. Everyone was like a chess piece. They were controlled by the strings of fate. But without those chess pieces, the chessboard was meaningless. It didn't matter how good a chessboard was, it was a dead object. The chess pieces could lead to many events and combinations of moves, which was what led to a path. A chess piece led to a path and a road to traverse. Without a chess piece, there was no path. When Han Sen understood the meaning of this, happiness rolled through him. He was too happy, and it was that glee that prompted him to speak it out. People thought Han Sen was crazy and ignorant. Only Li Qier and Exquisite could understand the way Han Sen truly felt. Their pretty eyes fluttered strangely. Han Sen had gained understanding, which meant they understood as well. They were drowned in the will of Under the Sky. That will was so strong that they would only see something like this in a select few of the strongest very high currently living. But on this day, under the influence of that powerful will, they had learned something new. How could they not be surprised and happy? This understanding is already beyond what a normal deified could manage. Li Qier had a very complex look on her face. She was happy, but she also couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Han Sen was only a half-deified, and yet, he could understand the entirety of that will. Han Sen had self-learned all of this, and his under-the-sky knife skills were supremely strong now. Before he only used knives. But now, the knives were infused with his own understanding and knowledge. It was like he had given life to a concept. Before, although Han Sen hadn't been injured by Shale, he had seemed to be on the brink of disaster. Han Sen had only been hanging on by a thread, and he could have been killed at any moment. But now all of a sudden, things seemed different. Han Sen was still suppressed by Shale, but the audience sensed that he was more relaxed than ever. Even within this danger, he seemed to be oh so relaxed. He didn't feel nervous or crushed. Han Sen used his hands like they were knives. The knife skills he deployed had a solid feeling to them, and it made people feel as if he had set things up like this deliberately. But now, Han Sen could use his skills at will, with almost casual ease. It was like every attack was unleashed randomly, yet he continued to fight with the exact same precision. and sometimes even more. The sky and the ground are a chessboard, and I am the chess piece. Every breath and every sense are a path. Han Sun was totally drowned in the will of under the sky. As his knowledge of it deepened, his attacks seemed to become even more random. But at the same time, it seemed like the universe itself was guiding his movements. As attacks rained down on him, there was a sinking feeling in Shale's gut. Yes, he was feeling terrible. Although Han Sun wasn't putting him in any serious danger, Shale felt as if everything had gone horribly wrong. He couldn't tell what precisely had gone wrong, but everything about the fight now seemed off. The mountains were wrong. The rocks were wrong. Everything was wrong. It felt as if the world around him was now working against him, while Han Sun was moving smoothly between sky and earth. It was like everything was working to assist Han. Senator Shale didn't know what to do. This isn't the sky and men combined together, a technique from the very high sense. Li Chunxiu and the others who studied the very high sense looked at Han Sun as if they were seeing a ghost, with their eyes wide open. By practicing the very high sense, one could practice sky and men combined together. By connecting the skill with the universe, the sky, and the ground, a practitioner could use it to borrow the power of the universe. But that power was only available to those who practiced the very high sense. Only they should have been able to do what Han Sun was doing. Exquisite could only barely scratch the surface of learning it. She wasn't fully proficient with sky and men combined together. Han Sun had never studied the very high sense, but the knife skills he got from the textless book had achieved the same effect as sky and men combined together. How could Li Chunxiu and the others not be shocked? Even those who practiced the very high sense found themselves shuddering. Despite his emotional detachment, Li Chunxiu was stunned. This kid is so weird, Open Sky Elder mumbled. He and Chiyu Elder hadn't practiced the very high sense, but they were behaving as if they had never eaten pork and were now seeing a pig run. They had experienced a lot over their lives, and even if they hadn't practiced the very high sense personally, they knew a lot about it. Right now, Han Sen's knife skills resembled the very high sense in sky and men combined together. They were shocked, but Han Sen didn't think that much about it. He was submerged in the aura of his knife mind. In this universe, every blade of grass, block of wood, mountain, drop of water, and even specks of dust and bacteria, they all seemed to harness a meaning in his eyes. It was like it all had some kind of connection with his knife skills. Everything in this world is a chess piece. Every chess piece can be used in a certain way, and you combine all these pieces to compose a game of chess. The chess piece that isn't connected is actually connected. Every chess piece can affect the entirety of the game. And what I need to do is become a chess piece that can change the course of this game of chess. Han Sen kept trying to understand. I don't need a special power. I only need to use my power in a place that requires me the most. If I go swimming, I would be a fish. If I went into the sky, I would be a bird. I would go along with the universe, the sky, and the earth. And I will help the sky, the earth, and the universe. Han Sen's knife skills were becoming more and more unpredictable, and those random attacks were causing Shale a lot of trouble. The very high that had previously mocked Han Sen for being crazy and ignorant had now fallen silent. Han Sen should have been at an incredible disadvantage, but right now, he didn't seem to be struggling at all. Instead, Shale's attacks were the ones that seemed stiff. They didn't seem so smooth anymore. How very interesting. He's used under the sky to create sky and men combined together. Those very high elders are going to go crazy with jealousy. As Yu Shanshin watched Han Sen's remarkable knife skill, the corners of his mouth rose. His smile was strange and unreadable. Chapter 2686 Under the Sky Knife. Li Shuecheng and Li Yuzhen's faces were turning green. They felt like they were going crazy. Their eyes were full of red, bloodshot lines, and they clenched their fists tightly, unaware that their nails were digging into the palms of their hands. They were like two madmen as they watched Han Sen make battle. Impossible. This is impossible. They felt as if they were going to suffocate. A half-deified was fighting a deified, and was no worse for wear. It made them feel more and more nervous about how things were going to turn out. They were afraid that the unthinkable might actually happen, and they might lose their bet. No way. There is absolutely no way that a half-deified can defeat a deified in combat like this. Plus, this deified is the one and only Shale. Our fears cannot come to pass. I am positive Shale will win. Li Yuzhen hissed slowly, gnashing his teeth. It was like he was speaking to himself as much as to Li Shuecheng. His eyes remained glued to the screen in front of him. Shale's eyebrows were furrowed slightly. Although he was still in charge of the situation, he did feel as if there was something wrong. Every move Han Sun made seemed to be guided by the hand of God. Shale had difficulty repelling even the most casual slash that Han Sun directed toward him. Ordinary strikes were more effective than should have been possible. Regardless of how much he analyzed Han Sun's techniques, Shale didn't understand what was happening. Shale wasn't someone who was willing to just lay down and let himself lose. So, when he felt that something was wrong, he made the best decision he could. The hellish flames around his body roared high, and he ignored Han Sen's attacks and rushed toward his opponent. No matter how dexterous you are with your skills, your power is no match for mine. My power will crush you and your skills alike. I can summon enough force to break your techniques. Shale was like a demon god. He carried scary substance chains with him as he thundered forward to suppress his foe. Han Sen's knife air slashed at him, but the substance chains crushed it. Han Sun was unable to break through the substance chains to damage Shale's body. Han Sun didn't panic though. His body floated from side to side like a cloud. Shale had gathered an immense amount of raging power, but he was unable to hurt Han's senator. It was like watching a little boat go up against a big wave. The big waves were going wild, but they couldn't flip the boat that effortlessly surfed from crest to crest. Han Sun was like a holy man that could ride the wind. His body was brimming with the energy of his knife mind. Shale continued to bump Han Sun around, but he couldn't ruffle Han Sen's clothing. Bishi watched Han Sun and Shale's fight with a gaping mouth. Well, Shale. He was wondering if Shale was going to lose, but he realized he shouldn't make such a suggestion in front of Li Chengqiu. So he swallowed the words. I'm afraid he is going to lose. Shale is strong, but he comes from a bad place. His practice time was too short. If there had been another 3 years to train him, perhaps he wouldn't be in this situation, Li Chengqiu said coldly. Bishi nodded. That kid Han Sun is lucky, yeah? But by the way, his knife mind really is something quite special. It exudes the presence of sky and men combined together. That isn't sky and men combined together. He is just following the will of the sky, Li Chengqiu said. Compared to you, big brother, he is nothing. But compared to ordinary people and creatures, his will is disturbingly impressive, Bishi said after a moment. Li Chengqiu nodded and said, Exquisite and Li Qier both use Han Sun as their silkworm. Outside of the very high, a genius like this is very rare. Open Sky Elder looked very relaxed right now. He smiled and said, Deified. So what, even if you are deified, you are still going to lose? My eyesight isn't too bad. Jiu Elder looked at him with disdain. When Shale became deified, Open Sky Elder looked like he was watching his own parents die. But of course, Jiu Elder didn't say that out loud. As the fight went on, more and more of the very high noticed that Han Sen's grim situation had taken a turn for the better. Shale fought with bestial strength, but he still couldn't bring damage to Han Sr. Han Sen's knife skills are very good. They are more than good. They are top class. They really are knife skills that come from the sky. Of course, the sky were kicked out by our race. We should expect this from one of their knife skills. Hey, how about this? If Han Sun really does achieve first place, I wonder what that asshole Li Shuecheng's face will look like. I still don't think he will win. Han Sen's knife skills are strong, but his power isn't any better than Shale's. Shale cannot hurt him, but he cannot hurt Shale. This fight will end without a winner, but neither will there be a loser. If they fight long enough, maybe the stamina of the half-deified will deplete. With the deified having greater stamina, he will be able to outlast and win that way. Who knows? You're making a lot of guesses there. Haha. If Han Sun takes first place, Li Shuecheng's face will look brilliant. Li Shuecheng won't be the only person devastated. Li Yuzhen will be in the same boat. Without Li Yuzhen, Li Shuecheng would never have known treasures weren't allowed to be used in this silkworm bout. I really hope Han Sun wins. And then, I want to see the faces of those two assholes. How dare they try to trick us? Li Shuecheng and Li Yuzhen's faces already looked fairly amazing. Their eyes had almost popped out of their sockets as they watched the battle video. He won't lose. Shale will not lose this. He will win. He will win. The two of them were going insane. Their mouths kept repeating those sentences. The unease within them was growing with every passing second. The sky and the ground are like a game of chess that keeps changing. Everything is like a knife, and they all have a path. Shale, try to taste my under-the-sky knife. Han Sen's knife mind was like a volcano that could no longer keep its magma inside. It erupted in a large fountain at Shale. Han Sun used his hand like a knife and slashed towards him. Good job. Shale had power, but there had been nowhere for him to use it. Now that Han Sun wanted to fight directly, this was perfect for him. Scary substance chains gathered on his fist, and he threw his fist forward to meet Han Sen's attack. Buzz! Space rippled and shattered under the force of Shale's punch. Substance chains that looked like demon lions ripped through reality around him. Lion mouths became giant black holes in space, and they tried to swallow Han Senator, but Han Sun remained unmoving. His hand kept swinging downward, but no knife air appeared around his hand. His hand fell in a simple cutting motion. The sight filled the audience with confusion. As they watched, they saw all of the mountains and rivers of the valley, the grass, the flowers, and the woods, become consumed by a knife light. All different kinds of knife lights all across the valley lit up. Night lights suddenly seemed to make up the entire landscape around the two fighters. And all of those attacks were coming for Shale. Countless knife lights crossed each other. There were so many, it was like a flood. All of them surged toward Shale and his demonic lions. Shale summoned the power of his substance chains. He wasn't afraid of those king-class knife lights, but he realized belatedly that there were too many of them. Scary demon lion punch powers and substance chains were breaking in the middle of that knife light. Chapter 2687 Apollo said at that moment. All anyone could see was the image of Han Sun thrusting a blade forward. Every object in the universe seemed to be releasing a knife light. They all followed the will of Han Sen's blade, pulling together into a barrage of knife lights that covered the sky and the ground. They were all coming together around Shale, who looked like a demonic lion. Not even an elite like Shale could block knife lights that appeared to have been generated by everything in the universe. The demonic lion surged toward Han Sun, determined to push through the tide of knife lights. He was breaking through the rush of attacks like a dam against a flood. Impossible. Shale cannot lose a fight like this. No, no, no. Li Yuzhen and Li Shuecheng's jaws were clenched, and their nostrils flared. And then their mouths fell open. They were too stunned by the sight before them to even make a noise. In their hearts, however, torrential tears of sadness were coming down. But their inner cries wouldn't be able to save Shale. As the knife lights flooded into Shale, appearing relentlessly from the sky and ground, the demonic lion began to break. Shale's body couldn't take it anymore. The moment the demonic lion broke, the substance chains across Shale's body were shattered by the flood. The knife lights began to slash directly across his body, and his deified form was dealt a river of wounds. The knife lights were only half deified in level. 1 slash, 10 slashes, even 100 slashes, wouldn't have been enough to damage the deified Shale. But these knife lights were beyond counting. Their numbers appeared infinite, and as they attacked in ceaseless succession, not even Shale's deified form was able to withstand the stream. Of course, this was all because of Shale's deified body wasn't strong enough. If he had achieved true invincibility, it wouldn't have mattered how many knife lights were thrown at him. Regrettably, his body wasn't that strong yet. Seeing Shale's body inside that flood of attacks, with blood flying everywhere, Li Yuzhen and Li Shuecheng almost collapsed to the floor. Open Sky Elder and the others, however, were in sheer euphoria. Exquisite and Li Kier were immeasurably happy too. They could feel Han Sen's knife mind with Under the Sky in operation. By watching this fight, they had been able to learn Under the Sky knife skills. Ultimately, that scary flood of knife lights hadn't come directly from the sky or the ground. Not even a little. It was all a knife light Han Sun had already cast. After it broke, it melted into the sky, the earth, everything there was. He used the powers of the sky and the earth to reconstitute that energy into knife lights. This was similar to knife silks but even better. The sky and the ground themselves had become carriers for the knife lights. After the knife lights were generated, they appeared in every element imaginable. They had become far scarier than the pure knife silks that Han's son had used for so long. The knife lights that broke and entered water, after they were generated to become knife lights again, would carry the water element with them. When the knife lights melted into the soil of the mountains, after they generated again, they would carry the elements of the mountains. But under the sky still relied on Han's son's own powers. It had taken a long time for Han's son to accumulate enough power in his surroundings to pull off this attack. The more Han's son used knife lights during a fight, the stronger the knife light flood would be when he finally activated it. That meant this skill required a lot of time to prepare. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to unleash such a vast amount of power. Under the sky is decent. With this skill, Han's son can fight others of the same level, or a higher level. If he can repeat this whenever he wishes, he will be an unbreakable combatant. If he can last a long time, then when under the sky explodes, others of the same level would never be able to block this knife light torrent that is absolutely everywhere. It was unfortunate Shale ended up going against Han's son. Li Kier concluded with a sigh, looking at Shale. His body was out of his control. The endless flood of knife lights were tossing his body away like flotsam on the ocean. To beat Han's son, he would have had to defeat him quickly. Han's son's enemies will have to defeat or suppress him in a short amount of time, lest they end up losing, Exquisite said. His use of Under the Sky is excellent. It allowed him to completely dominate Shale, right at the end. It looks like I will have to focus on training Shale against this power. When they fight again, Han's son will not be able to use Under the Sky knife anymore, Li Chunqiu coldly said. He didn't get emotional about Shale's failure. Instead, he analyzed precisely why Shale was losing, and how he could further perfect Shale as a warrior. Han's son slashed and then stopped. He didn't allow the flood of knife lights to rip Shale entirely to shreds. He raised his hands, and the knife lights everywhere shattered. They rose and disappeared. The valley was returned to the sound of silence. You win. Shale stood up. He could still fight, but he was now willing to concede to Han's senator after standing up. He teleported to someplace beyond the seal. He knew Han's son had dismissed the attack halfway instead of using its full power. If Shale had taken the full force of those knife lights, he would have been torn to pieces. So continuing to struggle was pointless. Li Shuecheng and Li Yuzhen were kneeling on the ground. Their eyes were frozen, and they could scarcely believe the result. They couldn't accept it. What do? We have to pay back a huge debt, and the open sky jewelry. The minds of the pair were struggling to work. Just one knife skill was enough to mimic sky and men combined together. This Han's son is fantastic material. It is a shame he is just a silkworm, and not a genuine heir of the very high. Open Sky Elder was delighted that he had won the bet, but he couldn't help but feel that Han's son's low status was a terrible shame. After the fight with Shale, no other silkworm dared challenge Han's senator. They fought each other, and eventually departed the valley. In the end, only Han's son remained inside the seal. When all the others had left, the seal was lifted. At the same time, a square bronze chest appeared. It descended from the sky, carried by warm light, to land beside Han's senator. Han's son grabbed the bronze chest and opened it. Inside were the 7 pieces that comprised the Apollo set. Han's son didn't bother pretending to be humble about all this. He put on the Apollo set immediately. There was a helmet, an upper chest piece, a lower torso piece, a pair of gauntlets, and a pair of battle boots. 7 deified treasures now clad his body. The chrome of the armor made Han's son look like a mirror man. When Han's son put on the last piece of the armor, a giant, silver pair of wings appeared on Han's son's back. They really did make him look like Apollo, shining in the sky. Many of the silkworms looked at Han's son with great envy, but Han's son actually had the audacity to complain. What kind of crap is this Apollo set? It's like I'm wearing a light bulb. This makes me stick out like a sore thumb. I'll be brighter than the sun itself. The enemy will see me coming from tens of thousands of miles away. It's not like I'll be able to hide in the bushes when I'm wearing this thing. It's like a giant bright neon target. Although Han's son was complaining, the Apollo set did exude a powerful aura. That made Han's son very happy. His half-deified power wasn't enough to activate the full might of the Apollo set just yet, but it would still complement his current standing. It could already generate a few minor substance chains. And that was especially true of the Apollo wings that had appeared behind him. They gave Han's son a speed that could rival a primitive deified. He might have even been a bit faster than Shale. Han's son spread the Apollo wings, then teleported next to Likir and Exquisite. His speed was far greater than it had been before. This is similar to the power I gain when I use the Peacock Soul Robe. The Apollo wings don't give me as much speed as the Peacock Soul Robe, but the power of the Apollo set isn't fully activated yet. Once it is used to its full potential, I might be able to fight larva deifieds like Meng Lai. Han's son admired his Apollo set. He really loved it. Chapter 2688 Broken Underworld. Silk the smoke and the fog were as heavy as rain. There was a garden that housed a lake, and Likir and Exquisite were sitting at a stone table nearby. They appeared to be in a state of confusion. Have you thought about Under the Sky's flaws? Exquisite asked, glancing at Likir. Likir shook her head. What about you? Exquisite shook her head as well. She frowned and said, For us, silkworms are a way of gaining new understanding. However, they aren't merely tools for learning. Our situation now is both good and bad. On the positive side, we're learning a lot from Han's son, and he's allowed us to feel what having a truly powerful will is like. He will help us accelerate our growth. But if we keep learning and following him, we will simply be copying his progress. We will be aping him, so to speak. And no matter how closely we try to replicate what he has done, we will never achieve what the true Han's son can accomplish. The path we tread must be one that leads to glory greater than our silkworms. We need to trailblaze a path of our own. But with the way things are now, that might be a very difficult prospect. Likir cut in quickly. Perhaps, but Han's son's will is too strong. At our level, we won't be able to pinpoint his flaws for our own betterment. The fact that we can confess something like that is terrible, without a doubt. He is supposed to be our silkworm. We are not supposed to be his. If Han's son leaves the impression that we cannot exceed his talents, then we are already limited by him, Exquisite said with a look of seriousness. In that case, what do you propose we do about it? Likir couldn't think of a way around this problem. If Han's son left an indelible impression of invincibility on their peers, then their achievements would be forever overshadowed by his own. That wasn't the sort of silkworm they were looking for. Han's son needs to lose once. A loss is the only way that impression of him can be erased from our hearts, Exquisite said. Even Shale lost to him. I highly doubt that any other silkworm will come close to rivaling him in the near future. Likir looked at Exquisite with confusion. She wasn't entirely sure what her third sister was implying. Why do you suggest it has to be a silkworm? Now that Han's son has achieved first place, he should be able to go to Jail Demon Hall. He can start practicing there. First, it will be a great help for his own abilities. Secondly, he will probably get crushed. Once that happens, he will lose his confidence and cockiness. Thirdly, it will break the image we have of him. We'll have a hard time viewing him as being so incredible if he gets defeated. That sounds like 3 birds with 1 stone, if you ask me, Exquisite said coldly. This is a brilliant idea. Now let us go and register his application to enter Jail Demon Hall. Open Sky Elder earned a lot from Han's son, so I doubt he will refuse his request to go there, Likir replied merrily. Han's son and Bauer were still fishing at Underworld Lake. Likir gave an underworld silk to Bauer, so Han's son no longer had to share his own. But Han's son was still feeling quite depressed. After he fished up the Xian Yellow Sutra, the only things he had pulled from the lake were utter trash. Rusted armor and broken weapons were a frequent sight. He had even collected bits of broken statues and the like. One time had been particularly bad. While he was fishing, he latched onto something super heavy. He had instantly assumed, based on the weight, that he had snagged something amazing. He spent half the day reeling it in. When he finally pulled it free of the lake, It was just a 3-meter-tall statue with shoulders and legs missing. Han Sen's lungs almost exploded. Bauer was sometimes able to fish up pieces of jewelry. Han Sen didn't know what they were for. And also the entire time, the 16 pigs continued to follow Bauer around. They frequently munched on Bauer's snacks. But they didn't grow at all. They each remained the size of a fist. They looked small and cute. But as far as Han Sen could tell, they were completely useless. If they were not spending their days eating and sleeping, they were sleeping and eating. It was either that or following Bauer's ass and running around everywhere. "Dad, come here. There is something coming. It is so heavy," Bauer suddenly exclaimed. Han Sen quickly approached her, and he started tugging the string. It really did feel like something absurdly heavy. It was like the other end of the string was attached to a small mountain. Han Sen and Bauer used all their strength as they tried to reel in the underworld silk from the lake. After pulling it for a while, they finally saw something coming up from below the swirling clouds. They could see its corner as it rose from the mist. "What is this thing?" Han Sen looked shocked when he saw the item. Based on what he could see, Han Sen could tell that the item was built from bronze. It had an opening that was 1 meter wide at the top, and narrowed as it went farther down. As the bronze item was slowly pulled up, more and more of it appeared above the fog. Han Sen could soon see that this bronze item's opening was 1 meter in size. It was a statue of a sheep's head. No, not a single sheep's head. Each of the object's 4 corners held a sheep's head. "This thing. It looks like a 4-sheep cube," Han Sen thought to himself when the bronze item finally slid into full view. Pang! It sounded as if something had broken. Although the bronze item had almost completely been removed from the lake, its ascension came to a halt. The underworld silk holding the statue had snapped. Han Sen watched the 4-sheep cube sink back into the mist of the lake. He didn't know if it was an illusion or not. But Han Sen could see the 4 sheep heads seemed to smile strangely at him as the object disappeared. Han Sen stared at the lake in confusion. The underworld silk had broken with ease, which was a first. Han Sen and Bauer had spent a long time fishing with underworld silks, and never before had this happened. Now, the underworld silk had simply snapped without them understanding why. He wanted to ask Likir and Exquisite, but they weren't present. Han Sen had nothing else to do except continue his mellow fishing experience. "It has been a few days. Mr. White should have some news for me. I should ask Likir to take me to the desert again," Han Sen said to himself as he continued fishing. He had a simmering sense of excitement regarding the Xian Yellow Sutra. Han Sen wouldn't even have to practice the strange Geno art. He only had to reverse his Blood Pulse Sutra to make use of it. How lucky was he to stumble on such an easy new Geno art. "I hope the Xian Yellow Sutra is useful," Han Sen thought to himself. But then he suddenly heard Bauer shouting, "Dad, something is coming. Come and help me." Han Sen saw Bauer's small hand clutching the underworld silk. She seemed to be struggling. The underworld silk had latched onto something heavy that kept the line taut, just like earlier. Han Sen raced over to her and grabbed hold of Bauer's underworld silk to pull the next item up. Whatever he was bringing up now was heavier than the 4-sheep cube. Han Sen and Bauer fought against that immense weight. There was a power that was pulling downward, struggling against them. They were on the verge of losing the underworld silk, or getting pulled into the lake themselves. The 16 little piggies came over too. They all stood in a line to bite the underworld silk. Then they leaned back, pulling it like a big game of tug-o-war. "Put your back into it, comrades. 1-2, 1-2. 2 people and 16 small piglets were pulling the silk. They all shouted. After half a day, they finally saw something emerge from the lake. When they finally saw it, Han Sen couldn't help but shout, "It is the 4-sheep cube again." Chapter 2689 Jail Demon Hall. "We managed to fish it up again." Han Sen was shocked. He thought about the 4-sheep cube that plummeted back down with the 4 eerie faces smiling at him. He looked closely at the heads of the sheep. He jerked back in surprise. The bronze sheep had their eyebrows lowered, and their eyes were half closed. They looked like monks that were meditating. They were no longer smiling as they were earlier. Are the expressions on the 4 sheep heads different? Han Sen wondered to himself. Then he heard a pang. The underworld silk snapped again. Han Sun watched the 4-sheep cube quickly sink again. This time, he could see the bronze sheep heads clearly. Their meditative expression was gone now. The sheep smiled creepily. It looked as if they were squinting their eyes to look at them. Is that thing alive? Han Sun wondered curiously. But before he could examine it any further, the 4-sheep cube was lost in the lake once more. Now this is weird. Why have we fished up the same thing twice in a row? And why does that thing seem as if it is alive? Do living creatures actually exist in the antimaterial world? Han Sun pondered. He didn't know much about Underworld Lake, and he would have to wait for Li Qiu and Exquisite to return, so he could ask them. Many more occurrences followed that one though. Bauer managed to fish up that 4-sheep cube a number of times. She could never pull it all the way up though. The object would always detach and fall back into the lake. As for Han Sun, he only ever managed to fish up useless garbage. The triangular symbol on the small jade figure lit up. Han Sun knew Li Qiu and Exquisite were on their way back. Not long later, he saw them appear via teleport on the shores of the lake. Han Sun, I understand you are always keen to hunt xenogenics, yes? We have found a suitable location for you. There are primitive deified xenogenics to kill, and it is safe. You will have the chance to take down a primitive deified xenogenic solo, Li Qiu said with a smile. There's such a good hunting ground out here? Why didn't you tell me sooner? Han Sun asked, looking at Li Qiu with suspicion. Before the silkworm bouts, there were places that you weren't qualified to enter. Now that you've earned first place among the silkworms, though things are different, Li Qiu explained. I see. Han Sun's mind wandered back to the 4-sheep cube. So he told them about his experience, trying to fish it out of the lake a few times. When they heard the story, Li Qiu and Exquisite's faces both went gray. Exquisite looked at Han Sun and asked, the 4-sheep cube you fished up, would you say it was 3 or 4 meters tall? Exquisite described the 4-sheep cube she was thinking of, and it turned out to be the exact same one Han Sun had seen. Yes, that is the one. Is there a problem with it? Han Sun asked, glancing at the two women's expressions. He knew there was something dodgy about this. Li Qiu and Exquisite looked at each other. Exquisite said, this 4-sheep cube is something the very high have fished up before. After saying that, Exquisite stopped. And then, Han Sun asked, let me explain. Li Qiu looked at Han Sun with a strange face and said, our people have fished up the 4-sheep cube before. But that thing is not an omen of good luck. All the very high who fished up the 4-sheep cube ended up having misfortune fall upon them. Han Sun's heart jumped. He frowned and asked, what happened to them? Were they injured, or did they just end up dead? Li Qiu shook her head. They were neither hurt nor killed. According to the histories of the very high, there were 3 very high that fished up the 4-sheep cube. One of them was the one who made the sky and sky palace. Isn't that a good thing? Why would you consider that unlucky? Han Sun didn't understand what she was trying to say. Building a race and becoming supremely powerful was something glorious. Why would they consider that a misfortune? Well, with a wry smile, Li Qiu went on to say, the second very high that fished up the 4-sheep cube had something happen to him. It made him kill his parents. And then he betrayed the very high. After pausing, Li Qiu said, the third one that fished up the 4-sheep cube ended up stealing an important treasure from the very high. Then he disappeared. Where he went no one knows. So whoever fishes up the 4-sheep cube is from the very high. And they have all betrayed the very high. Now Han Sun understood why the 4-sheep cube might have been deemed unlucky. Although there is no proof, there are records that confirm that the 4-sheep cube was connected to all 3. Exquisite had a wry smile. Han Sun coughed awkwardly. I'm not from the very high. I will leave one day. That doesn't mean I will betray you one day, does it? Exquisite went very quiet, then said, the 3 very high that I talked about only fished the 4-sheep cube once. They never saw it before or after that one time. But you seem to have fished it up 6 times. Although the whole betrayal thing is just a guess, this item is considered taboo for our race. You and Bauer should never again mention the fact that you fished up the 4-sheep cube. It is best not to stir up any trouble. Han Sun nodded. He had originally thought it might be a useful item. But he'd had no clue it was actually so profoundly unlucky. He wasn't going to mention what he fished up to anyone else. That being said, he didn't know many people in the very high. Even if he wanted to tell someone else, there was no one he could tell. Let's go. You two shouldn't visit Underworld Lake for a while, Exquisite said to them. Then, she teleported Han Sun and Bauer away from the lake. Han Sun asked Li Kier about the place they were headed, a location known as Jail Demon Hall, and what sort of xenogeniacs he would be able to kill. He learned that the place used to be a mere cave, but the very high built a palace atop it. Calling the structure a palace was a bit misleading though. In actuality it was more like a prison. A xenogeniac had lived in the cave beneath Jail Demon Hall for a long time. The creature lacked the power to escape its prison, but after a while, it learned how to create a doppelganger that could enter the palace above the cave. The doppelganger was a primitive deified. Now every so often, the very high had to go to Jail Demon Hall and kill the doppelganger to make sure that the xenogenic stayed contained. Li Kier and Exquisite had already filled out the paperwork that would allow them to hunt in Jail Demon Hall. Now that his request had been granted, Han Sun would be given the chance to solo a deified xenogeniac. A primitive class deified xenogeniac, huh? I can test the strength of my Apollo set this way, and earn a deified xenogeniac gene as well. That is 2 birds with 1 stone, Han Sun thought happily. The Peacock King Beast robe and the 6-core snake bow were items Han Sun didn't dare use while Li Kier or Exquisite were around. He didn't want them to realize that beast souls and treasures were different. His new Apollo set would do a great deal to help Han Sun keep his secrets. The 4 of them went to Jail Demon Hall. There, Li Kier pulled Bauer to the side so that Han Sun could enter Jail Demon Hall alone. The rest of them would wait outside. Han Sun wasn't suspicious. He thought they just wanted to get more of his battle experience and knowledge, and that was why they had asked him to go and kill the doppelganger xenogeniac. He pushed the door open and entered Jail Demon Hall. Chapter 2690 Scary Primitive Deified Xenogeniac Jail Demon Hall had been built for that xenogeniac. When Han Sun entered it, he couldn't feel the restrictive effects. The hall's architecture was incredibly strange. The floors of an ordinary hall were usually flat or subtly sloped as they led up toward a stage. Inside this hall, however, all 4 sides of the hall led down a series of broad steps to a 10-meter-long stone platform at the bottom. The stone platform was covered in symbols that Han Sun had never seen before. Although he had no clue what they meant, he could sense a strange power coming from the runes. An ink-black stone pillar sat in the center of the stone platform, and it ran all the way up to connect with the hall's ceiling. The upper portion of the pillar was covered in engravings and markings, but Han Sun's attention was instantly drawn to the pillar's base and to the creature that had been bound there. That creature looked vaguely humanoid, but the body was insectal. Its shell was blood red, and a red horn rose from its head, making it look something like a unicorn. Its eyes also flashed with a bloody crimson color. It was full of rage and murderous desires. While Han Sun observed that trapped creature, the creature stared up at Han Sun too. It suddenly opened its mouth and revealed the jagged, saw-like teeth that adorned its maw. It let out a high-pitched scream at Han's senator. It began to thrash around violently, and when it moved, the markings across the stone pillar lit up. The chains attached to the pillar also began to glow. They tightened their grip on the creature, making it harder for the furious being to escape from the stone pillar. It really is a primitive deified. Upon seeing the red substance chains appearing around the creature, a delighted expression crossed Han Sen's face. Outer Sky had many xenogeniacs, but most of them were very frightening. It would have been too risky for Han Sun to go out and pick a fight with some random xenogeniac. Now, a primitive deified xenogeniac had been handed to Han Sun on a platter. Han Sun was extremely pleased with the way this was turning out. Han Sun donned his Apollo set, and then, the Apollo wings fluttered slightly. They sent him zipping toward the stone platform in an instant. He turned his hand into a knife and slashed at the xenogeniac bound to the stone pillar. Han Sun was still using Under the Sky, but with the extra strength that the Apollo set was giving him. A frightening substance chain knife air was unleashed as he activated the skill. His attack was like a sunlight blade, as it came down against the Xenogeniac's neck. The Xenogeniac hissed like a viper, and its red substance chains exploded like a volcano. It broke free of the restraints of the stone pillar, and its talons flashed toward Han Sen like red blades. Catcha! Han Sen's knife air was as strong as the strike of an ordinary primitive deified. But against that Xenogeniac's claws, Han Sen's attack didn't stand a chance. Before Han Sen could even attack, the creature had brushed aside his attack and rushed within striking distance. The hand knife and the claws collided. The claws left deep cuts across Han Sen's gauntlet. 3 bloody scratches across his hand before to ooze blood. Fortunately, Han Sen was able to react quickly. He abandoned his attack and then teleported away. If he hadn't reacted instantly, the creature's blow would have amputated his hands. Why is it so strong? Han Sen wondered in shock. He had just finished teleporting away when the Xenogeniac was in front of him again. Its claws came down on his chest, cutting straight through the Apollo armor like it was made of butter. The wings of the Apollo set flapped. Han Sen quickly retreated, putting more distance between himself and the Xenogeniac. But there was a glow of bloody light around the creature's body, and it came for him again like a rocket. Its speed was unfathomable, and again, its claws were digging into Han Sen's chest. The red substance chains became claw-like lights, and they carved 5 grooves deep into Han Sen's chest. His ribs were almost visible through the wounds. Is this guy really just primitive? Han Sen muttered in consternation. He used Under the Sky and teleported rapidly as he attempted to get ahead of the Xenogeniac. But it was a futile endeavor. The Xenogeniac seemed to predict every movement Han Sen sought to make. Han Sen had only just moved away when the Xenogeniac was in front of him again. Han Sen screamed, his voice strained. A talon had perforated his stomach. If Han Sen hadn't teleported away fast enough, his guts would have been strung across the floor. He was fortunate that the Apollo set was a deified treasure. But even so, beneath the sharp claws of that malevolent Xenogeniac, it seemed no stronger than wet tissue. It didn't have the defensive properties that a deified set of armor should have given him. Han Sen no idea what to do. Although he was fighting a primitive deified, it was only a doppelganger. His true opponent, the real body controlling the creature before him, was a scary true god deified. This body was just a doppelganger, but it was undoubtedly the best that a deified could be at primitive class. It was in a whole different league than Shale, who had just become a deified. Even more frightening, its will and its movements were true god class. Han Sen was very proud of his will and power, but before a true god, his capabilities were measly. He was borrowing power from the Apollo set, so he could fight at a deified level, but he still couldn't endure the Xenogeniac's attacks. Every very high that came to defeat this doppelganger would usually encounter a larva deified for them to kill. Transmutation class deifieds would still take a long time to kill. Exquisite and Likir had told Han Sen this was only a primitive deified. They hadn't told him how scary the creature was though. Once Han Sen realized how powerful it was, he knew he shouldn't push his luck and continue trying to fight it. He used his teleportation abilities to escape Jail Demon Hall. The attacks he had already survived had left him bloody and injured. If he kept going, there was no doubting the fact he would end up dead. Is that Xenogeniac really a primitive deified? Han Sen asked, still clutching the wound in his belly. He looked at Likir and Exquisite with suspicion. It is true. It really is a primitive class deified, but he is the greatest primitive deified alive. We thought that with your power and will, you could fight it. That is why we signed you up to take it on. I can only suppose we were too hasty, Exquisite said, making sure that her voice sounded quite serious. Her facial expression was a carefully crafted mask of disappointment. In her heart, she was actually thinking, it is good for you to suffer failure every now and again. We don't want you getting too cocky in the future. Likir provided her own sort of comfort. She smiled and said, losing here is perfectly understandable. After all, you aren't yet deified. Not being able to beat that fiend means nothing. How about this? We will find weaker deified Xenogeniacs that are easier for you to defeat. Han Sen knew Likir and Exquisite wouldn't be lying to him about this stuff. If they said that the Xenogeneic was a primitive deified, then it probably was. That Xenogeneic really was strong. Han Sen paused, observing Exquisite and Li Qier. Then he said, "Is there a time limit to kill this Xenogeneic?" "It will take 6 months for the jail Demon Hall's Xenogeneic to build up enough power to escape its prison. Usually, our people try to kill it within 3 months, just to be on the safe side. If it escapes and gets in contact with the other Xenogeneics in outer sky, it might be able to save its true self," Li Qier said. "If there is still time, then I will try to defeat it again." Han Sen didn't want to just give up. Chapter 2691 Xian Yellow Sutra. Of course you can. If you are confident enough, you can try as many times as you want. But this doppelganger has already been here for a month. If you cannot kill it in the next couple of months, we will have to send in a deified elite that is strong enough to kill it. So remember, you have a limited amount of time, Exquisite said. That should be more than enough, I should think, Han Sen said with a nod. He was still thinking about the fight he had just endured against that Xenogeneic. Han Sen thought his fighting power was decent at this point, but that Xenogeneic had completely suppressed him in every way imaginable. Aside from the power gap between them, there were also important differences in the ways that the two of them fought. Now that he thought about it some more, he realized he had been completely suppressed. He had lost in the most embarrassing way possible. It was just a doppelganger, and yet it had such a scary amount of power. I wonder how strong its true self is then? Han Sen wondered to himself. Exquisite and Li Qier looked at each other. They had played Han Sen perfectly, and now they could barely suppress their laughter. Han Sen didn't know that the doppelganger he battled was different from most other doppelgangers. It was kind of like a child of the true god Xenogeneic. Although its power was indeed primitive class, the battle experience it possessed, and its skill and will, were top-notch. Han Sen was the only person who would struggle to defeat such a beast. Even most deifieds would lose badly against this opponent. Let him lose a few more times against it. Let's wear him down a bit. Li Qier smiled and thought to herself. Han Sen's wounds recovered quickly. To aid his self-recovery power, Li Qier and Exquisite provided him with a genofluid produced from Xenogeneic genes. It was very good for healing one's physical wounds. With the combination of those two powers, every speck of damage had disappeared within 7 or 8 hours. Over the next few days, Han Sen went to the jail Demon Hall to do battle against the Xenogeneic. He came up with many different plans to bring the creature down, but every attempt was useless. The longest Han Sen was able to last inside was 2 minutes. Once he was done, he had to teleport away. If he hadn't, he would have been killed. He would only be given a sliver of time to cast his knife airs. Even when he used Under the Sky, it seemed to do nothing to the Xenogeneic. Not only did he fail to kill it, but he couldn't inflict a single wound on his foe. It really is too strong. Han Sen couldn't help but compliment how frighteningly powerful his latest Xenogeneic opponent really was. But despite his repeated defeats, he never thought about giving up. As soon as his body recovered, he went back to the jail Demon Hall to fight. He was determined to find a way to kill it. But every time he went there, he would leave disappointed. The Xenogeneic was too strong to be predictable, and so Han Sen couldn't figure out the creature's patterns, and use those to manipulate it, either. The more Han Sen went, the more Li Qier and Exquisite started to worry. They had only wanted to get rid of some of Han Sen's pride. They wanted to use that Xenogeneic to wear down his resolve. But if he kept going on like this, and he eventually broke down completely, they would have a destroyed silkworm on their hands. Fortunately, they hadn't sensed any sign that Han Sen was about to give up. Although he kept losing, after each failure, he would just start thinking about how he might defeat the beast the next time he did battle. His entire mind seemed devoted to coming up with ways to defeat the fiend. He never wasted brain power on thinking about anything else. That made Exquisite and Li Qier feel a little safer with what they were doing. They just hoped that the time limit would pass soon. Then, Han Sen would have no choice but to give up. It wouldn't destroy too much of his confidence, they predicted. No, that still won't work. Han Sen failed again. He dragged his body, which was riddled with slashes and puncture wounds, out of the jail demon hall. He shook his head. Exquisite and Li Qiu weren't there. Because Han Sun now spent his entire days either fighting or healing, they stopped hanging around after the first few days. It was dull. They would occasionally come back to feel how Han Sun felt during the fight, but not all of the time. Also, due to the fact that Han Sun kept losing, they were only learning how to deal with failure. That didn't help them much. Because there wasn't much else for them to learn, they stopped focusing on his thoughts as much. It looks like taking down that Xenogeniac won't be easy. Hey wait, it's almost time to meet up with Mr. White. I need to go to the core area. Han Sun thought about the Xian Yellow Sutra, and he realized it was time for him to take a break from fighting. When he saw Li Qiu again, Han Sun mentioned his need to visit the core area again. Li Qiu hastily agreed to his request. She and Exquisite had grown worried about Han Sun's constant fighting in the jail demon hall. They were worried that being defeated endlessly might do too much damage to his confidence. Now that Han Sun had expressed a desire to go to the core area, they thought it was a best-case scenario. Li Qiu took Han Sun back to the oasis, so he could enter the core area. Of course, Gu Qingqing was there at the place they were supposed to meet. When he saw Gu Qingqing there, Han Sun couldn't wait to ask, "Okay, what did you learn? Did you receive news from Mr. White?" "This is what Mr. White asked me to give you." Gu Qingqing passed a notebook to Han Sun, alongside the original version of the Xian Yellow Sutra. Han Sun accepted them, and put away the Xian Yellow Sutra. He opened up the notebook to have a look. The pages were filled with an elegant script, which had clearly been written by hand. The notebook had 100 pages, and almost all of them contained notes. There were only 2 or 3 pages that were empty. Clearly, Mr. White had put a lot of effort into this. Mr. White really is so nice. There weren't many people who were as kind as Mr. White, Han Sun decided. He was the sort of person who did impressive things and achieved a lot. He was no common man. Instead of leaving the core area, Han Sun remained there to read Mr. White's notebook. He didn't want Li Qiu and Exquisite looking over his shoulder as he studied, metaphorically speaking. The content of the notebook was a detailed analysis of the Xian Yellow Sutra. It also had notes on the problems it might cause, and the aftermath of using it. As Han Sun read through the content of the notebook, he learned a great deal. And not just about the Xian Yellow Sutra, either. He began to understand the Dongxian Sutra and the Blood Pulse Sutra to a higher level. Mr. White is a real grandmaster. Compared to him, I am just a peasant with some good luck and a bit of motivation, Han Sun murmured, shaking his head as he closed the notebook. Actually, Han Sun's compliment wasn't strictly accurate. Everyone's path to study was different. Mr. White had focused on acquiring knowledge. He knew so much, which put him on a higher plane than Han Sun when it came to intellectual pursuits. But then again, Han Sun wasn't the sort of person who focused on amassing huge amounts of knowledge, so it wasn't strange that Mr. White outmatched him in that area. Comparing the two men in such a singular way wasn't very fair. Han Sun memorized everything that was written in the notebook, but he didn't want to destroy it. After all, Mr. White put in the time and effort to write it all out by hand. Take this back to Planet Eclipse and ask Zero to hide it. Han Sun gave the notebook to Gu Qingqing so she could take it back. After Gu Qingqing left, Han Sun tried to digest the content of the notebook. The more he thought about it, the more shaken he felt. Based on what Mr. White had described, if Han Sun finished practicing the Xian Yellow Sutra, it would become a very scary power. Is it really possible to reverse blood pulse? Han Sun was shocked. If what Mr. White told him about the Xian Yellow Sutra was accurate, it was terrifying. Chapter 2692. For your convenience in his writing in the notebook. Even Mr. White had admitted that his thoughts on the Xian Yellow Sutra were only theories. He hadn't tested any of these predictions in the real world. To find out how much power the Geno art would really have, Han Sun would have to practice it. Mr. White did mention, however, that there were risks associated with practicing the Xian Yellow Sutra. The Geno art could theoretically reverse a person's bloodline, but doing so would be very dangerous. Attempting such a feat would have consequences throughout Han Sen's body. If his body was unable to withstand those effects, the ramifications could be dire. Han Sen was very tempted to learn it because of the scary powers that the Xian Yellow Sutra offered. But the risks were severe enough to make him hesitate. Since I don't need to practice the Xian Yellow Sutra, and I don't actually need to use it, there is no point in me trying to reverse my bloodline. After Han Sen came to this conclusion, he decided to put the Xian Yellow Sutra out of his mind. Now he turned his attention back to the Xenogeniac in Jail Demon Hall. He had less than a month to go. If he was unable to kill it in that amount of time, then he would lose this opportunity. He would need to wait for the next doppelganger to show up before he could fight it again. How can I kill it then? I will have to wait until Liqueur and Exquisite are somewhere else, so I can try to kill it with a different Geno art. That's my best chance, Han Sen thought to himself. When he left the core area, Liqueur was there waiting for him in the oasis. Why are you back here so soon? Liqueur wasn't worried like she had been the last time. She was actually surprised to see him return so quickly. In truth, she had been hoping that Han Sen would stay in the core area until the Xenogeniac in Jail Demon Hall was killed. I was just meeting up with a friend. I don't have much time. I need to kill that Xenogeniac in Jail Demon Hall, so I couldn't stay there for very long, Han Sen said. You're really going to keep trying, aren't you? You're planning on returning to Jail Demon Hall. Liqueur said to Han Sr., why shouldn't I keep going there? It is rare to tackle such a powerful enemy, and it isn't as if I have to worry about my safety. This is the perfect opportunity for me to hone my skills, Han Sen said with sincerity. Liqueur looked at Han Sen, her head tilted slightly to the side. She could sense that Han Sen was speaking the truth. No matter which race they came from, ordinary people would struggle to maintain their drive and dedication in the face of such overwhelming failure. Most people could only have their dreams crushed so many times before they gave up. Han Sen had failed many times already, but he hadn't been broken down. His resolve was strong, and he clearly intended to keep on going. That sort of personality had its upsides and downsides, that was for sure. Liqueur opened her mouth to say something, but no words materialized. She didn't want to destroy Han Sen's positivity. Whatever. There is only a month left. With his unbreakable determination, it shouldn't bode too ill for him, Liqueur thought to herself. After returning to Jail Demon Hall, Han Sen continued to challenge that Xenogeniac every day. And every day he kept failing. After 2 weeks had passed, Liqueur and Exquisite rarely visited anymore. He had failed far too many times, and he had yet to learn anything new. There was no reason for them to spend time watching such pointless fights. While he was occupied doing his own thing, the girls wanted to practice the knife skill under the sky, which they had learned from Han Senator. Although their mental access to Han Sen's personal experience made it easier for them to cast the powerful skill, they were still having difficulty getting anywhere close to the talent Han Sen had with the skill. He is very talented when he fights. This kind of knife skill and knife mind are very rare to see. He should be a great help for us when practicing the very high sense, Liqueur complimented. It is a shame he isn't one of the very high. Otherwise, with his level of talent, he might be able to practice the very high sense, Exquisite said, her voice carrying a distinct note of regret. Liqueur sneered slightly. What is good about practicing the very high sense anyway? I don't want to become one of those cold-blooded monsters. If I was given the choice, I would have never decided to practice it at all. It is because you have a 10 armor talent. Those with an armor talent that high must practice the very high sense. That is the rule of being one of the very high, Exquisite said. But why me? I really wish my talents were below 9 armors, Liqueur grumbled. Han Sen lost his next fight. He stumbled out of Jail Demon Hall, covered with injuries. But then, he suddenly saw a very high man standing outside the hall looking at him. Han Sen didn't recognize this very high, but the man's eyes definitely looked hostile. This guy can't be Li Shuecheng, can he? Han Sen thought to himself. In his time in Outer Sky, Li Yuzhen and Li Shuecheng were the 2 people he had offended the most. He had seen Li Yuzhen before, but he had never seen what Li Shuecheng looked like. Even if this man wasn't Li Shuecheng, he was probably related to those 2. Han Sun, you have been using Jail Demon Hall for 2 months. If you cannot kill the red blood demon, then get out of there. Don't waste people's time, Li Shuicheng said. Staring at Han, Senator Li Shuicheng and Liu Zhen had lost everything after the silkworm fights. All they had left were their undies. Their parents had helped them pay back most of their debts, but they still owed a lot to a lot of people. Right now the two men had nothing. Literally nothing. Even the resources they needed for practice had to be used as payment for others. Li Shuicheng had the idea of fighting the red blood demon. The red blood demon's xenogeneic gene was required in order to craft a particular deified treasure. If he could get his hands on that xenogeneic gene, then Li Shuicheng could use it to earn more resources. Li Shuicheng couldn't kill the red blood demon alone, but he had his family backing him. If his family helped, he could probably take down the red blood demon. But when Li Shuicheng went to Open Sky Elder to request admittance to Jail Demon Hall, he was told that Han Sun had already registered there to be the one that killed it. He would have to wait until Han Sun failed before applying again. Li Shuicheng didn't believe Han Sun had what it took to slay the red blood demon. So he came to the Jail Demon Hall to see how things were progressing. And there, he found Han Sun getting repeatedly wrecked by the red blood demon. Exquisite told me, I still have a month to go from the time I was allotted when I was signed up. Is that incorrect? Han Sun asked coldly, meeting at Li Shuicheng's gaze. If you don't have the required power, another month won't make any difference. Why not just give up now? Save yourself some time and stop inconveniencing others, Li Shuicheng shot back. I see. You say others, but you really just want me to do something that will benefit you, Han Sun said to Li Shuicheng, squinting slightly. You are correct. Rather than staying here and wasting everyone's time, just quit and save us all the trouble, Li Shuicheng said flatly. You are right. Making the lives of others more convenient is a nice thing to do. I shouldn't waste someone else's time. I should have finished here sooner, Han Sun said with a nod. He looked like he was agreeing with what Li Shuicheng said. That is a reasonable way of thinking. If you want to cancel your registration, you must visit Open Sky Elder. I can take you there, if you want, Li Shuicheng said, expecting Han Sun to genuinely throw in the towel. No. You misunderstood me. I will kill the red blood demon. Therefore, there will be no need for you to waste more time waiting for me, Han Sun said with a laugh. Chapter 26 93 Blood Marrow Geno Fluid. Kill it? What? Are you going to kill it with boasting? Li Shuicheng looked at him with disdain. The red blood demon wasn't like ordinary primitive deifieds. Not even Han Sun's Apollo set would be enough to let him fight the creature. Han Sun had already stated his intentions. He was going to kill the red blood demon. Han Sun acted as if it would be the simplest thing in the world. But to any of the very high, it would have sounded like he was daydreaming. If you don't believe me, then feel free to wait around. It isn't my time that's being wasted after all. Han Sun shrugged, as if he didn't care one way or another. After that, Han Sun settled himself next to the stone pavilion to rest. The damaged Apollo set would take a while to recover as well. Fortunately, the Apollo set was good at mending damage it had sustained. If it hadn't possessed such advanced self-repair abilities, it would have been a pile of scrap metal already. Red blood demons' fighting abilities are overpowered. If I was already a primitive deified, killing it would be easy. But right now, as I am, depending on the power of treasures will make it very difficult for me to bring this beast down. Han Sun kept thinking about how he fought before. He was trying to find a way in which he might kill the red blood demon. Because Exquisite and Li Kier had been focusing on practicing under the sky, they hadn't been visiting Han Sun very often. Han Sun thought that he was right on the precipice of his chance to succeed. He just needed to find a chance to fight the red blood demon when they were not around. Then, he could use whichever Geno art or beast soul he fancied. Li Shuicheng frowned. The very high were very strict about their rules. Even though he was one of the very high, he couldn't circumvent the rules. If Han Sun wasn't going to give up, Li Shuicheng really would have to wait another month. If Han Sun couldn't kill the red blood demon before the time limit, Li Shuicheng could register for permission to enter and slay the fiend. But Li Shuicheng was being hung to dry. He was in a rush to get as many resources as possible, so he didn't want to wait a month. He rolled his eyes. He walked to the stone pavilion, looked at Han Sun and said, "You said you will find a way to kill the red blood demon, right?" "That is correct," Han Sun said with a nod. He had been fighting the red blood demon for a while now, and he hadn't really gotten much out of it, other than a general understanding of the red blood demon's capabilities. "Very good," Li Shuiqing said, nodding to himself. Then he turned around and left. That surprised Han Senator. He wasn't sure what the man meant by that. Han Sun had thought Li Shuiqing would hang around and annoy him for a while, but the man left without another word. Han Sun thought about the expression he had seen on Li Shuiqing's face though. It was unlikely that the man would give up so easily. Li Shuiqing left Jail Demon Hall to seek out Liu Zhen. "You know that Han Sun has been in Jail Demon Hall trying to kill the red blood demon, right?" Li Shuiqing asked Liu Zhen. "So, does it matter whether I know this or not?" Liu Zhen was annoyed by just hearing Han Sun's name. He had lost so much on his wager during the silkworm fights. Although his family had paid off much of the debt, he still had a lot he needed to repay. Paying it all off would be incredibly difficult. At this time, Liu Zhen was in no mood to wonder about what Han Sun was doing. Just thinking about how to pay off all of his debts was enough to make his head explode. "I was going to ask for someone's help to kill the red blood demon and gather more resources. But Han Sun registered to kill the red blood demon before I did. I need to wait another month before I can register." Li Shuiqing explained what had happened. "What is that supposed to mean?" Liu Zhen didn't understand why Li Shuiqing was bothering to tell him all this. The very high were strict when it came to the law. The two young men had no choice but to abide by them. If Han Sun had already registered for permission to hunt, then as long as he didn't concede, no one could go there and attempt to steal his kill. As far as I know, he has been in the Jail Demon Hall for a while. He has been fighting the red blood demon every day. I don't think he can actually kill the red blood demon. I think he wants to use the red blood demon to practice his fighting skills. I think he will keep going until his time there is up," Li Shuiqing said. "Is there a problem with that? Many of our people do the same thing." Liu Zhen still didn't understand what Li Shuiqing was talking about, but he knew the other man had to be hinting at something. Upon hearing Liu Zhen say this, Li Shuiqing laughed. But there was something sinister in the sound of his laugh. He said, "You know that many students of our race have done this in the past. Why have fewer attempted such a thing in recent years?" "That is because..." Liu Zhen trailed off halfway through his response. He now understood what Li Shuiqing was getting at. He looked at Li Shuiqing with shock and said, "You want to use the glitch in Jail Demon Hall to kill Han Sun? That isn't very nice. If the rest of our people find out, it will be considered a huge crime. We might end up being exiled to confinement on a small and empty island. Not if Han Sun activated the glitch himself. If that happened, it would have nothing to do with us." Li Shuiqing grinned darkly. He then went on to say, "He was the reason that we lost everything. Are you really going to sit back and accept that?" Jail Demon Hall's restrictions originally weren't as strong as the real body of the red blood demon. Because of that, the beast almost managed to escape. When it was realized how close the red blood demon came to escaping, our elders added another security measure to guarantee that the red blood demon could never break free. If the doppelganger gains enough power to break out of the first level of restrictions, then the extra security protocol goes into effect. Jail Demon Hall instantly goes into complete lockdown. A long time ago, one of our primitive deified warriors was battling the red blood demon. The red blood demon became enraged and activated that special restriction. When the Jail Demon Hall went into lockdown, it trapped that primitive deified inside. He was unable to teleport away. When they opened Jail Demon Hall again, they found that the red blood demon had already eaten the man. All that was left of him was a little blood on the floor. Liu Zhen said quietly. But when that happened, they decided to modify the restrictions. They increased the level of power needed to trigger it. Unless the red blood demon went completely nuts, I don't think it would be able to trigger that security measure again. Han Sun can't really threaten the red blood demon, so there's no way he could inspire that much fury in the creature. So, how could he trigger the glitch? If he isn't able to do it, we can help him. Every time he leaves the hall, he's badly injured. He uses very high fluids to heal. You've met the man before, and you have a connection to the current situation that I think we can exploit. I'm sure you can give him some better fluid to recover, right? Li Shuiqing said. You mean like blood marrow fluid? Liu Zhen's eyes brightened. Now he knew what Li Shuiqing really meant. Blood marrow fluid was made from the red blood demon's xenogenic genes. It was very good for recovering from injuries. Of all the healing fluids that existed, it was one of the priciest. It was usually used by deified elites. It worked very well for deified wounds, so its efficiency with kings went without saying. As long as a person wasn't dead, they could be healed in a short amount of time. But not many knew that because the blood marrow fluid was made from the red blood demon's xenogenic genes, the red blood demon was very sensitive to it. Using a small amount wouldn't have much of an effect. But if Han Sun used too much and then entered Jail Demon Hall, it might trigger the true ire of the red blood demon. 2694 Triggering the restrictions. Because Han Sun was being injured every day, he required a lot of healing fluids. Exquisite came to see him every few days to resupply him. Aside from providing him with healing fluids, she gave him other kinds of fluids as well. They could help with all sorts of things involving his body and his practice. They were fluids synthesized by the very high themselves. Due to the wealth of resources available in outer sky, Han Sun was being given access to resources that few kings could ever hope to get their hands on. The very high didn't have a large population. They didn't have many people devoted to producing healing fluids, but they also rarely used healing fluids themselves. So most of the time, the very high created the fluids quite slowly. They kept enough on hand for ordinary use, but as Han Sun stubbornly continued to fight the red blood demon, he had created a situation that the very high were uniquely unprepared for. Within a month, Han Sun had almost cleared out their fluid reserves. If he wanted more, he would have to wait for more to be created. That meant one every few days. Why are there no more healing fluids? Han Sun saw the fluids Exquisite had brought him, and he noticed they weren't the same fluids he usually used. Rather than the healing fluids that he really needed, these other fluids would merely reinforce his genes and physical power. Even if there was a whole warehouse full of healing fluid, it wouldn't be enough to support the amount you keep consuming, Exquisite said. She pointed toward a box with 6 red fluids and went on to say, "This is a high-class healing fluid. They only offer it to deified fighters. Since there are no more of the weaker fluids available, you are being gifted these. Do not go through them willy-nilly. If you use up these, you won't be granted any more for the next 2 weeks." Exquisite didn't know that blood marrow fluid had the xenogenic genes of the red blood demon in it. After all, few people knew exactly what was inside a medicine when they took it. The red blood demon's xenogenic genes were just one element of these fluids. They weren't even the primary ingredient. Even if Exquisite had known the xenogenic genes were in the fluid, she wouldn't have known about the potential side effects in this situation. Liu Zhen and Li Shuiqing knew about this because one of their elders had used a large amount of blood marrow fluid before going into the jail demon hall to kill the red blood demon. The red blood demon had instantly gone into a fury. Luckily, the man had been a larva-class deified. Despite the red blood demon's rage, he had been able to kill it. Only a few people who were close to that elite knew about this. Exquisite and Li Kier didn't know much about that elite, so they didn't know how taking the fluid would affect the monster inside the hall. Liu Zhen and Li Shuiqing wouldn't have come up with this plan if the creature's reaction to the fluid was generally known. Hearing that there was an even better fluid that he could use, Han Sun was more than pleased. If he could recover faster, he could spend more time fighting the red blood demon. Although he was unable to beat the red blood demon, he was honing his talents as he fought the creature. That was because the red blood demon had been continuously suppressing him. Han Sun had gained a huge amount of experience by being so determined. This kind of wound really hurts. Han Sun looked down at his chest and saw his exposed heart, which had come close to being shredded. He had a wry smile. If Han Sun had lacked his impressive abilities of recovery, such a strike would have likely killed him. Opening a blood marrow geno fluid, Han Sun quickly gulped it all down. He felt a warm sensation race through his body. A numb, itchy feeling passed over his wounds, and Han Sen's injuries began to heal. He watched in amazement as his wounds sealed closed. This is good stuff. No wonder this is considered a superior item, usually reserved for deified elites. The effects are 10 times stronger than what I was using before. Han Sun grinned widely when he saw the wounds heal so quickly. His wounds would have taken half a day to heal previously, but now they took less than an hour. But the Apollo set hadn't recovered yet, so Han Sun had to keep waiting. Without the Apollo set, his body wouldn't last. Han Sun didn't waste a single second of his free time though. He practiced very real body and God's Wander for a bit. Those 2 Geno arts were very beneficial for him to practice with. They could be used at any time. When the Apollo set had finally recovered, Han Sun decided it was time to enter Jail Demon Hall again. But to Han Sun's surprise, the red blood demon was sitting on the stairs staring at him when he entered. It didn't attack him as soon as it saw him. What is this? Han Sun wondered. It seemed odd that on this random day, the red blood demon's temper had improved so much. While Han Sun wondered what it was doing, the red blood demon's body flashed with a bloody light. Its bug wings opened. The strange horn on its head flashed with a crimson that looked like a sun. Holy shit! What is going on with this guy? Why has it suddenly exploded with a scary power like this? Han Sun was very confused. He had fought the red blood demon for a very long time now, but he had never seen it so enraged. And it had suddenly gained a frightening amount of power. Before Han Sun had time to consider his situation, he saw the red blood demon's evil-looking crimson eyes light up like light bulbs and turn to stare at him. Han Sun didn't say anything. He just wanted to teleport away from Jail Demon Hall. Han Sun couldn't fight the red blood demon at its normal power level, but now, it was a raging version of itself. For all he knew, this thing could destroy his body in one punch and cripple him, leaving him no chance of teleporting away. But the moment Han Sun ripped space open to leave, he saw all of the markings across Jail Demon Hall light up in a single brilliant flash. The whole of the Jail Demon Hall was covered in a holy light. Pang! Han Sun bounced out of space and almost hit the ground. He descended into a nice roll, which was how he managed to maintain his balance. What is this? Why have Jail Demon Hall's restrictions flared up and sealed the entire structure with me inside? Han Sun's face changed. He looked around frantically, and he found that wavy beams of light covered every surface of the hall. The whole building was sealed up tight, and there was no getting out now. Han Sun realized that he was in a scary and dangerous situation. Jail Demon Hall was sealed, and he couldn't use God's Wander to leave. He was trapped inside with the beast. Furthermore, the red blood demon had become far more dangerous than usual. When Han Sun had fought the red blood demon previously, he could only last a few minutes. But now the red blood demon was in a scary mode. Thinking of this, Han Sun turned his attention back to the red blood demon. The red blood demon's eyes were giving off red light. It looked like a small flashlight, the beam of which landed on Han Sr. What is this? I thought we were friends. I'm just taking a break here. You go and do your stuff. No need to worry about me. Han Sun forced a smile at the red blood demon as he spoke. The red blood demon actually smiled back at Han Senator, but that smile sent a chill down his spine. The jagged, razor-like teeth that lined its maw were particularly menacing to see. It was like a demon that could destroy and devour anything. The next second, the red blood demon let out a strange screech. Its body was like a red shadow, and it was coming straight for Han Senator. Han Sen's eyesight couldn't read its movements, either. He saw the flash of a red shadow, but the red blood demon remained where it was. Then another red blood demon appeared in front of him. Its sharp claws were already digging into his chest. Chapter 2695 Trapped inside the Jail Demon Hall. Pang. The talons of the red blood demon tore through Han Sen's body, and it exploded like a water balloon. The next second, The water that had separated began to gather up again. It reformed Han Sen's face. But before the water finished reconstituting Han Sen's body, the creature spread its claws again. Once more, it swung at Han Senator. The red substance chains that went with the attack erupted like a volcano. Han Sen was shocked. He had used his original Water King body to escape that first strike, but right now, his body still hadn't coalesced. If he was hit again, all of his cells that had been turned into water would become nothing. Even the original Water King body wouldn't resurrect him a second time. Han Sen could no longer afford to hesitate. In a moment, his body glowed pure white as he entered his Super God Spirit mode. The volcanic-looking red substance chains went right through him, passing harmlessly through his shadow. But just as Han Sen started using his Super God Spirit body, some strange power knocked him back out of it. He was back to his usual self in no time at all. Han Sen's stomach sank. With Wanner still inside his Destiny's Tower, his Super God Spirit mode had been severely downgraded. Again, it had been cancelled before he could use it to finish a fight. The red blood demon didn't give Han Sen any time to think. Its body became a crimson shadow that went straight for him again. It was like a real demon, and it moved toward him too fast for his eyes to follow. Han Sen teleported away regardless, because he wasn't trying to escape Jail Demon Hall. He didn't trigger the building's restrictions. But by the time Han Sen had teleported away, an evil smile had already crossed the red blood demon's strange face. Again, it appeared directly in front of Han Senator. 5 red-clawed fingers reached forward to shred his heart. Han Sen's eye flashed red. That red color spread across his body, and then he simply disappeared. He went straight into the red blood demon's eye. Han Sen had been pushed far enough that he had no choice but to use his blood eye evil god's beast soul. With the eye skill, he entered the red blood demon's eye. Doing this might allow Exquisite and Likir to suss out the secrets of beast souls, but he had no choice. He couldn't let the red blood demon kill him, just to keep his secrets. In the red blood demon's eyes, Han Sen's surroundings were pure red. It was completely different from the eyes Han Sen had entered before. Han Sen felt a bit relieved for a moment. Just as he thought he had escaped all of the danger, he saw the redness around him begin to boil. The power rose up around him like scary flames of blood. That power carried a scary presence, and it turned the whole of the eye world into a flaming red sea. Han Sen could feel the power inside the bloody flames. He didn't dare stay there any longer. He teleported out of the red blood demon's eyes. This guy is too much for me to deal with. As soon as Han Sen teleported out, the red blood demon was coming for him with its red substance chains lashing around. It reached Han Sen in an instant. Han Sen's purple eye began to spin as he used the purple eye butterfly beast soul to trace the movements of the red blood demon. He used the power of all the beast souls he had, without hesitation. He used Move Mountain Area's area beast soul, and even his own Dongxian area. He used Jade Skin, the Blood Pulse Sutra and more. He used everything he could to repel the monster. He pushed all of his powers to the max. Aside from the Peacock King Soul Robe, that couldn't be worn in tandem with the Apollo set, Han Sen used every beast soul he had at his disposal. Even so, Han Sen's power and speed were unable to close the gap between him and the red blood demon. He used his formation and judgment powers to their full potential, and he barely dodged the next attack. Catcha! When the red blood demon attacked for the 3rd time, it was already too late for Han Sen to avoid. The red substance chain brushed right by his ribs. 3 of his rib bones snapped instantly, and his flesh was torn through. I have to fight for my life again. Han Sen's mind was still calm at that moment though. Thinking too much about things wasn't going to help him now. He needed to calm down. He used the full potential of every power he could to battle the beast. He had to stall for as much time as possible, also he could be saved. Jail Demon Hall has some kind of isolation protocol? The Very High must know about this surely. I need to keep going until the Very High come. Then I can be saved. Han Sen tried to comfort himself. But Han Sen had forgotten one thing. Outer Sky was way too big, and there weren't many of the Very High. Jail Demon Hall was far away from where most of the Very High lived. It was in the middle of nowhere, and there was usually no reason for anyone to visit. If the Very High noticed there's something amiss, It would still take them half an hour to get there. It might even take them longer than that. Han Sen didn't know if he could even last that long. At this time, Li Yuzhen and Li Shuiqing had been focusing their attention on Jail Demon Hall. When they saw Jail Demon Hall's door suppress the red demon beast's light, they knew that their plan had succeeded. The red blood demon had already gone mad with rage and triggered the defensive properties of its prison. They had trapped Han Sen inside with the infuriated red blood demon. The guy in charge of Jail Demon Hall won't be able to get here for at least half an hour. And half an hour from now, I don't think there will be anything of Han Sen left to save, Li Yuzhen said with a cold laugh. Li Shuiqing looked at Li Yuzhen and asked, "Is the warehouse okay?" "Don't worry. Everything is fine. The healing genofluids Han Sen always used are all gone. The warehouse only has the recommended, superior healing genofluids left. No one will know that a genofluid can trigger the red demon blood's power. Even if they found out it was the blood marrow genofluid that triggered the red blood demon's rage, they couldn't blame me. It would just be an unfortunate event, caused by no one but himself." "That is great," Li Shuiqing said with relief. He smiled and went on to say, "Exquisite just gave him some genofluids too. She won't be here for another 2 days at least. He is very dead this time. He is such a genius. It is a shame he has to die. But no one asked him to be our enemy." Exquisite and Li Kier were practicing under the sky, trying to employ Han Sen's experience to their advantage. All of a sudden, both of their phones rang at the same time. They saw the number, and it shocked them. "Why is the inspection department calling us?" Li Kier asked with confusion. She quickly answered her phone. It didn't take long for Li Kier and Exquisite's faces to change. Li Kier screamed, "What?" Jail Demon Hall's restrictions have been triggered. Because Jail Demon Hall's restriction powers have been activated, they had no way of learning what was going on inside either. All of their scrying powers have been cut off due to the hall's defenses. So, right now even the inspection department couldn't tell what was happening inside the hall. They had already sent out an agent. When they found out who was in charge of Han Sen's challenge to the red blood demon, they contacted Exquisite and Li Kier. They asked if the two women knew if Han Sen was inside, because the restrictions had been triggered 10 minutes before. "It is over." Exquisite and Li Kier felt cold. Only Han Sen had permission to hunt inside that hall, so he was the only person inside. If the red blood demon had triggered the defenses, Han Sen was probably the reason that it had done so. After the two of them spoke to the inspection department, they used God's Wander to travel to Jail Demon Hall. They prayed Han Sen wasn't inside, but the closer they got to Jail Demon Hall, the colder they felt. That was because they couldn't sense their connection with Han Senator. Something was smothering their ability to feel what he was feeling. There weren't many powers that could sever their connection with Han Senator. The power that bound the true god Xenogeniac within Jail Demon Hall was one of the only things that could. There was an 80% to 90% chance that Han Sen was trapped inside Jail Demon Hall. He could even be dead already. Chapter 2696 Reversing Bloodline. Every second inside Jail Demon Hall was a desperate scramble as Han Sen attempted to cling to life. Thus far, he had only been inside the hall for 1 minute, and his body had already incurred 7 or 8 wounds. Those wounds were so deep that bones were visible inside them. Damn it! This isn't the way. Han Sen felt terrible. His power was no match for the monsters, and the skills he had were losing their effectiveness. I have to try this out. As Han Sen teleported away, he used the moment's reprieve to pull out a piece of gear. It was a peculiar bottle. The handle was the tail of 2 sirens. It was the holy item siren bottle from the sirens in the Extreme King. Han Sen tapped on the left side of the siren bottle, but before he could take the next step, the red blood demon was in front of him. Its sharp claws were like knives, and Han Sen was unable to avoid them. He immediately summoned the shield of the Medusa's gaze to block the red blood demon's scary attacks. Although Han Sen couldn't use the power of the shield to attack, it still had amazing defenses. The red blood demon's claws came down on the shield, but failed to deal any damage to it. The scary power blasted Han Sen and the shield away though. Pang! Han Sen's body slammed into the back wall of the hall. His entire body felt as if it had been shattered. It was almost too painful for him to stand back up. Han Sen got control of his pain and teleported away. The next moment, the red blood demon was right where Han Sen had just been. The red substance chains lashed out against the wall and made the spells flash. The siren bottle that had fallen to the floor was glowing weirdly. It displayed the face of the Siren Virgin. "Siren Virgin, I'm in trouble. Help me get rid of this guy." Han Sen quickly shouted at the Siren Virgin when she appeared. Han Sen had just said that when the red blood demon's talons flashed toward him again. Han Sen flapped his Apollo wings and, through careful judgment, decided to veer left. He managed to evade the attack. But the red blood demon's body flashed again. Those claws were right in front of Han Sen once more. Han Sen tried his best to dodge, but a substance chain still connected with his shoulder. The blow opened him deeply enough to expose pale white bones inside his flesh. "The red blood demon?" the Siren Virgin said in shock when she saw the red blood demon. "It's good that you know this creep. This is just a doppelganger though. It is only primitive class. Do you know how to deal with it?" Han Sen immediately asked as he teleported again. With a wry smile, the Siren Virgin said, "If my true body was still here, perhaps I could fight it. But right now, I still don't have a body. There is no way for me to help you. Although it is just a doppelganger, the red blood demon is a doppelganger that carries the battle experience of its true self. It isn't like an ordinary primitive deified. So I wish you luck." After that, the body of the Siren Virgin shrank. She returned to the siren bottle. Han Sen didn't have any time to be angry. The red blood demon was already on him again. He had nowhere to dodge, so he had to use the shield of the Medusa's gaze to block the strike again. Although the shield protected Han Sen's body from the creature's claws, it did nothing to soften the impact of the strike. It made Han Sen's body feel like it had been struck by a big hammer. Han Sen was unable to fight the fiend, and he knew he couldn't escape. He was at a dead end. "I can't keep going on like this. If this keeps up, my body isn't going to last. Even if I find a chance to strike back, I won't have any strength left to do so. I guess I will just have to try this." Han Sen gritted his teeth. The blood pulse sutra inside his body began to surge like mad. But this time, it was different. The blood pulse sutra's path ran in complete reverse. This Geno art was no longer the blood pulse sutra. It was the Xian Yellow Sutra Han Sen had fished out of the underworld lake. It was a different Geno art entirely from the blood pulse sutra. Han Sen was desperate. He had to try every option he had before it was too late. If Mr. White's theory of the Xian Yellow Sutra was correct, perhaps the Xian Yellow Sutra was the last thing that could save Han Sen's life. If someone else had attempted to practice the Xian Yellow Sutra, it would have been extremely hard. But to cast it, Han Sen only had to reverse the blood pulse sutra. He hadn't even needed to practice with it. But this was Han Sen's first time casting the Xian Yellow Sutra. He didn't know what would happen after he used it. The blood pulse sutra's power was gunning in reverse through Han Sen's body. It made him feel like his entire body was covered in static. It made him feel as if his body wasn't coursing with blood, but with electricity instead. The tingling pain almost made Han Sen, a man with a strong will, scream aloud. The blood pulse sutra usually released a red aura. In reverse though, that color darkened to a red that was nearly black. It was like old dried up blood. The red blood demon was unbothered by this change. Its eyes still looked murderous, and it swung its claws at Han Sen again. It would be too hard for Han Sen to dodge. His body was in so much pain that it felt like he was going to be torn apart. There was no way he could dodge the next strike. Han Sen gritted his teeth to endure the pain, and raised his shield to protect his body. At the same time, he punched toward the red blood demon. The red blood demon ignored Han Sen's fist as the claws came down upon the surface of the shield. Han Sen clutched the shield desperately. He moaned in pain. The reverse blood pulse sutra released its power, and it felt as if his body was being torn apart. The pain he felt was too difficult to describe. Pang! The red blood demon's blow came down on the shield. Han Sen's body flew away with the shield, but the Xian Yellow Sutra he cast also hit the red blood demon. Han Sen hit the seal again, and he once more coughed up blood. but he noticed that his wounds weren't as grievous as they had been. Then to his shock, Han Sun realized that the Blood Pulse Sutra had become half-deified. It had finally completed a key step in its ascension, combining the 9 tiers to revert back to 1. He quickly looked at the red blood demon. He wanted to know if the Xian Yellow Sutra had worked or not. The results were disappointing. The red blood demon didn't look as if it had been injured. It looked the same as it always had. Its presence was oh so scary. Before Han Sun could really get a good look at it, the red blood demon was already committed to another attack. Oh no, this is the end of the line for the great Han Sun. The Xian Yellow Sutra didn't work, Han Sun thought sadly. If the Xian Yellow Sutra didn't work, he would have to use the shield of the Medusa's gaze again. But with his body already injured, using the shield would probably end up sucking him dry again. This time he could die, and it was way too big of a risk. So despite the dire nature of his situation, Han Sun hesitated to use the power of the shield. But as he hesitated, something unbelievable happened. Han Sun could feel the red blood demon's power and speed lessen. Chapter 2697. Beating a deified. Han Sun used a teleportation trick to avoid the red blood demon's next attack. The creature's reaction speeds were clearly much slower than they had been before. Its reduced speed gave Han Sun the opportunity to slide out of range. Although Han Sun was still mostly outmatched by the red blood demon, he discovered that his powerful predictive abilities, when used in concert with God's Wander, were allowing him to begin protecting himself from the creature's attacks. Has the Xian Yellow Sutra started working? But this effect is much weaker than I thought it would be. It has only made the red blood demon a little bit slower. Even though his thoughts were negative, Han Sun was quite happy with this result. Although his enemy was only a little weaker, it was enough for him to keep going. He wouldn't be killed by the red blood demon, and that meant he could wait for the very high to rescue him. But as time went by, he noticed that the red blood demon's power was continuing to decrease. Its red substance chains became thinner and thinner, and many of them were starting to fray and break. What is going on? Han Sun thought in confused excitement. If this was the power of the Xian Yellow Sutra, then it really was scary. It was even weakening the red blood demon's substance chains, which were the essence of a deified's power. The shine of the red blood demon's armor started to dim, and its body seemed to be changing. The creature started to expand. It was like watching a bodybuilder slowly being transformed into a fat man. The body became bigger, but the strength and speed of the being decreased. Han Sun's fight was becoming easier and easier. He wasn't quite able to beat the red blood demon yet, but he was certainly able to protect himself. He didn't need to teleport away anymore at the very least. While Han Sun reveled in his sudden good fortune, he saw the red blood demon's blood-red substance chains explode like fireworks. Life force was leaving Han Sun's enemy, like the air from a leaking balloon. This cannot be a deified dropping to become half-deified, can it? Han Sun couldn't believe his eyes. But judging from what he could see, that seemed to be what was happening. There was no other explanation that made sense. The red blood demon's entire presence was more like a king class now, and its power was insufficient to generate substance chains. It didn't look deified at all. Pang! Han Sun was still holding the shield of the Medusa's gaze, and with it, he blocked the next strike from the red blood demon. Their powers were tied, and Han Sun wasn't tossed away like he had been before. Oh crap! The Xian Yellow Sutra is ferocious. It really did bring the red blood demon down from deified to king class. That is so scary. Han Sun was crazily happy. Although Mr. White had predicted that the Geno art would be very strong, Han Sun hadn't expected the effect of the Xian Yellow Sutra to be that powerful. It had reversed the blood pulse of a deified creature, sending it back to king class. The red blood demon's face was covered in disbelief. It was flabbergasted about what was happening to it. Now that we are both kings, the fun can commence. Han Sun's eyes started to shine. He had been suppressed by the red blood demon for so long, and he had almost been killed. Now it was time to unleash all the pent-up anger he had built up throughout the mistreatment. Die! Han Sun thundered. He pounced like a tiger toward the red blood demon. The red blood demon's battle experience and will were still there, but its power had been reduced to that of a half-deified. Han Sun used his Apollo set in his beast souls, and he carried deified power into battle with him. Now the advantage had switched. Although the red blood demon's mind and skills were strong, Han Sen's absolute power was still enough to turn the tables in his favor. And Han Sen's battle experience and will weren't weak either. And after all the time he had spent fighting the red blood demon, his experience had grown. His knowledge about the way the red blood demon behaved probably exceeded what the very high knew. Before, Han Sun lacked the power to fight the red blood demon. But now things had taken a turn. Han Sen's power had an absolute advantage, and he pressed that advantage hard, utterly suppressing the creature. His six-core snake bow kept firing arrows. All of the arrows punched through the red blood demon's body, making it weaker and weaker. Han Sun didn't know how long the Xian Yellow Sutra's power would last, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. He focused all of his power on killing the red blood quickly. Their initial fights had only lasted a few minutes, and this one wouldn't last much longer. Within 3 minutes, the red blood demon had been punctured a dozen times, and even more marks were left across its shell. It was bleeding everywhere. The Xian Yellow Sutra didn't just weaken enemies. It made their blood pulse reverse. Their bodies would devolve. The red blood demon was a far cry from the primitive deified that it had once been. Catcha! Han Sen's bowstring started cutting. When he was halfway through slicing the red blood demon's head off, the creature was reduced to squeals as it thrashed on the ground. As he continued with his work, Han Sun saw the red blood demon's red light flash. It was starting to coalesce substance chains again. Oh no! The Xian Yellow Sutra's power is waning. Han Sun was shocked. He didn't dare delay these proceedings. He generated power and went right up to the red blood demon. He wanted to kill it completely before it had the opportunity to recover. Fortunately, Han Sun had already injured the red blood demon badly. Now the creature was gasping its final few breaths. Exquisite and Li Kier tried their hardest to get to Jail Demon Hall. When they got there, people from the inspection department were already there. They were trying to shut down the restrictions that kept Jail Demon Hall locked. What's going on in there? Is Han Sun still inside? Exquisite asked in a rush. I don't know. When the restrictions of Jail Demon Hall activated, they cut off all connection to the outside. We have to wait until we have deactivated the added security before we can see what is going on inside. A member of the inspection department replied. Then what are you waiting for? Press the button and shut it down. Li Kier said. But the worker shook his head and said, we cannot stop it just yet. We have to wait until Open Sky Elder gets here. Why? Exquisite and Li Kier asked at the same time. Jail Demon Hall's security systems are active. That means the red blood demon inside is raging already. Its power is primitive class. But even so, our strength won't be enough to tame and defeat it. We need to wait for Open Sky Elder to get here before we lift the security, the very high man explained. We don't have time to worry about that right now. Hit the button. Han Sun is still in there. Saving him is more important, Li Kier said. The very high man shook his head and said, if Han Sun was in there, it has been over half an hour. He would have been killed by the red blood demon several times over by now. It is pointless for us to open it now. We should wait for Open Sky Elder to get here. Exquisite didn't respond. She teleported past the man. She was going to press the button to open the building. The two very high men gaped in surprise. They moved to stop her, but a voice halted them. Let her open it, Open Sky Elder said as he teleported beside them. When he received the news, he had come as soon as possible, but it had already been half an hour, and therefore, it was likely too late. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.